Hey guys, tonight we're kicking off an adventure that's going to blow apart everything you've ever believed about Santa Claus. The true tale, hidden under layers of jolly red outfits and flying deer, is way weirder, more intense, and incredibly captivating than any holiday yarn you've come across. This isn't a story set at the North Pole. It's about a real guy who existed, lived through tough times, and faced dangers that could have ended him for sticking to his convictions. By the end of this, your view of Santa will be forever changed. So before we jump into this amazing narrative as a team, I've got a quick request. If you're hooked on what I'm sharing, could you spare a second to tap that subscribe button and like this video? Maybe even leave a comment. I really enjoy checking out your ideas, your curiosities, and even your doubts. And hey, I'm wondering, where are you tuning in from at this moment? Your snug bedroom, a peaceful family room? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the globe from me? Tell me, I'd love to know. Now, lower those lights, settle in. Maybe switch on a fan for some soft background hum. And let's travel back through the ages together. Let's reveal the genuine Santa Claus. Imagine this scene. It's 270 AD. The location is a lively harbor town named Patara, tucked along the sun-soaked Mediterranean shoreline of what's now Turkey. But in those days, this was Lycia, part of the powerful Roman Empire, a place so unlike ours it could feel like another world. Patara's roads carried scents of ocean brine, exotic spices from faraway places, and the effort of traders bargaining over fabrics and ceramics. Vessels with swelling sails packed the port, their timber frames groaning as swells slapped the piers. This spot buzzed with trade, arts, and links between Eastern and Western worlds. And in this lively, bustling town, a young boy entered the world, born to a prosperous Greek Christian household. They called him Nicholas. Now, take a beat and really consider this. When Santa Claus comes to mind, we picture snowflakes, rooftops, treats, and drinks. But Nicholas spent his early years under the hot Mediterranean sun. He likely never encountered snow during his youth. The landscape near Patara featured olive orchards and cypress woods, not evergreen groves. The breeze was mild, scented with jasmine and wild herbs. This is the initial break in the legend. Santa's actual roots weren't in the icy North Pole. They were in a land of heat and brightness. Based on the oldest records, and I emphasize this since so much of Nicholas's life is wrapped in enigma, his parents were committed Christians. Some references name them Epiphanius and Johanna. Others mention Theophanes and Nona. We can't confirm for sure. What we do understand is they had wealth, strong beliefs, and they brought up their son with both. But this is where the narrative turns intriguing and somewhat tragic. Nicholas was still a kid when both parents passed away, possibly from one of the plagues that often ravaged the Roman Empire. Picture that briefly. A youngster, perhaps 10 or 12, abruptly left alone, receiving an inheritance he didn't seek in a society that could be harshly merciless. Many in his shoes would have clung to that fortune, using it for their own ease and protection. But Nicholas, as the tales recount, chose a bold path. He opted to distribute it. Now, I have to be upfront with you on one point. Nearly all we believe about Nicholas stems from writings composed hundreds of years following his death. The earliest ones date to the 500s, over 200 years past his passing. Consider that. It's like attempting to craft a precise life story of a figure from the 1820s based solely on tales handed down verbally over eras. How much would be accurate? How much enhanced? How much entirely made up? This is the core conflict in Nicholas's account, and it's an aspect we'll revisit often in this series. We're handling a person whose presence in history is nearly definite, yet whose true existence is annoyingly vague. We know he likely lived. We know he was probably the Bishop of Myra in the 4th century. But after that, we're navigating mist. Still, even amid that mist, forms appear. Patterns emerge, insights surface, not from papers, but from the enduring nature of the stories. Let me offer an illustration. There's a legend that Nicholas, in his youth, journeyed to Egypt and Palestine. Was it a spiritual trip, a search for wisdom? We're unsure. But consider what this reveals. This was an individual who didn't remain in comfort. In the 4th century, journeys were perilous. Thieves lurked on paths. Illnesses lurked in each settlement. The ocean could engulf entire vessels. Yet, Nicholas ventured out. This wasn't someone leading a secure, routine existence. At some point, again, the chronology is unclear, but likely in his 30s, Nicholas came back to Lycia. And this is where the myth truly starts to solidify. Per legend, Myra's bishop had recently died. The religious leaders and community assembled to select a successor. And some versions claim a heavenly revelation, others just sound judgment instructed them to pick the first person entering the church for morning prayers. That individual was Nicholas. Now, let's reflect on what being a Christian bishop meant in the early 4th century. This wasn't a role of riches and leisure. It wasn't akin to a contemporary minister with an office and steady pay. This was a potential death warrant. Because here's what many overlook about Nicholas's era. Christianity was outlawed. Following your religion could lead to capture, torment, execution. Emperor Diocletian, ruling from 284 to 305 AD, initiated one of the harshest crackdowns Christians ever endured. Places of worship were torched, holy writings were obliterated. Those refusing to honor Roman deities were labeled disloyal, and Nicholas, he stood firm. We lack precise details of his captivity, but we know it occurred. He was cast into a Roman jail, likely around 303 AD, at the peak of Diocletian's campaign. Try to envision what that entailed. Roman jails weren't like today's prisons. They were grim, grimy pits dug into stone or constructed below ground. No daylight, no clean air. Sickness spread wildly. Folks perished in those spots, isolated and overlooked. But Nicholas endured. And here's the pivotal shift. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine ascended and proclaimed the Edict of Milan, granting Christianity legal status. Abruptly, faith in Christ wasn't criminal anymore. The cell doors swung open. Nicholas emerged into daylight, remaining a bishop, now guiding in an altered society. Can you fathom that emotional swing? One moment, you're a fugitive in hiding, risking death for your principles. The next, you're a revered spiritual guide in an empire that now accepts your religion. It must have seemed like awakening in a new reality. But what intrigues me most in this segment of Nicholas's tale is that we possess virtually no records from his time about any of it. No correspondence from Nicholas, no formal Roman papers noting him among captives, no direct witness reports. Instead, we have narratives penned centuries later by folks aiming to motivate, educate, and craft an exemplar of Christian excellence. Does this suggest Nicholas never lived? No. Scholars typically concur there was likely a Bishop Nicholas of Myra in the 4th century. The devotion to Saint Nicholas was widespread by the 6th century, implying a genuine individual underpinned it. But it does require caution. We must distinguish the person from the folklore, and that's tougher than it appears, since the folklore is so persuasive, so lasting, so intricately embedded in global cultures. View it this way. Nicholas existed in a particular era and location. He was shaped by the 4th century Roman Empire. He spoke Greek. He maneuvered through evolving political loyalties, faith-based strife, and social shifts. He wasn't enchanted, he wasn't eternal, he was mortal. And that, to me, renders his narrative even stronger. Because here's the key. The actual Nicholas, whatever he truly was, accomplished something remarkable. He lived in a manner that folks recalled, not for 10 years, not for 100, for over 700 years. And that recollection, twisted and mythologized though it might be, conveys something deep about human priorities. Kindness, bravery, empathy, the readiness to offer when you could seize. These are the elements threading through each Nicholas tale, whether factual or fabled. And these elements would ultimately span lands, span eras, reshaping this Mediterranean cleric into the persona we now term Santa Claus. But we're jumping ahead. Currently, Nicholas is a fresh bishop in Myra, in a society still steadying itself after years of oppression. The myths haven't fully taken shape yet. The wonders haven't been documented. He's simply a guy striving to steer a group through unstable periods. What came after the accounts of his benevolence, his actions, his alleged wonders? Those are narratives that would be shared and reshared until they developed an independent existence. Some draw from true occurrences, some are total fabrications, and some reside in that odd, foggy realm between reality and fiction where fact and significance merge. In the coming segments of this series, we'll delve into those narratives, we'll assess the proof, challenge the legends, and aim to approach as near as possible to the authentic individual under the myth. We'll visit his jail cell, the renowned Council of Nicaea, the grave where his remains once lay. We'll observe as Italian mariners pilfer his artifacts in a bold nighttime operation. We'll witness how Dutch newcomers brought his legacy to America, how creators altered his likeness, and how businesses molded him into the planet's most familiar icon. But right now, I want to part with this idea. Nicholas of Myra inhabited a world utterly dissimilar to ours. Yet, his heritage somehow spanned centuries to influence our existence in the most surprising fashion. Each Christmas Eve, as kids suspend stockings near the hearth, they're engaging in a remnant of tales that originated in a sun-drenched Mediterranean town. Narrated by individuals who wished to trust that selflessness could overcome avarice, that compassion could withstand tyranny, that a single person could alter things. Was Nicholas all that the myths assert? Almost definitely not. But was he a figure worth commemorating? The reality that we're still discussing him 17 centuries on indicates yes, and that's merely the start. In the following segment, we'll plunge further into one of the gloomiest episodes of Nicholas's life, his confinement under Diocletian. We'll investigate what it truly signified to be a Christian in the early 4th century, what Roman prisons were genuinely like, and how Nicholas's ordeal as a captive formed the individual he became. Because to grasp the saint, we first must comprehend the pain. And believe me, that account is not what you'd anticipate. So hang in there with me. The adventure is only starting, and it just grows more intriguing from here. So here's a thought I want you to ponder. What would you be prepared to sacrifice your life for? Not in some vague intellectual sense. I mean, truly, if guards pounded on your door this evening and demanded you abandon your convictions, or they'd haul you off to jail, what would you choose? Most of us, being truthful, have never confronted that dilemma. We exist in a society where our principles, no matter what they are, don't usually carry a fatal penalty. But Nicholas, he dwelled in a society where declaring, "I am a Christian," could result in death, and not swiftly, not kindly. We're speaking of a culture that had mastered the craft of setting examples with individuals. So let's return back to the instant when all shifted. Back to 303 AD, when Emperor Diocletian concluded that Christianity wasn't merely erroneous, it was hazardous, a danger to Rome's core structure. Now, to grasp why Diocletian despised Christians so intensely, we need to pull back and view the larger scene. Rome in the early 4th century wasn't the invincible empire of lore. It was crumbling. Barbarian groups pushed at the frontiers, economic inflation spiraled out of control, military overthrows occurred with disturbing frequency. The empire was so vast, so cumbersome, that Diocletian divided it into 4 governing zones, simply to prevent total breakdown. And amid this turmoil, there were these Christians. They declined to revere the emperor. They refused to offer sacrifices to the classic Roman deities, the gods that, in Roman mindset, safeguarded the empire and secured its wealth. To a Roman authority, this wasn't merely blasphemy, it was betrayal. These folks were basically stating, "We won't join in the public faith that unites our community." Can you imagine how that would alarm those in charge? Diocletian viewed the Christians as an internal threat, a faction whose primary allegiance wasn't to Rome, but to some unseen deity requiring sole commitment. So on February 23rd, 303 AD, Diocletian released the initial of what would turn into 4 decrees aimed at Christians. And let me assure you, these weren't mild recommendations. The first decree mandated the demolition of Christian churches and the incineration of holy texts. Christians lost their status and legal privileges. They couldn't initiate legal actions. They couldn't defend in trials. Overnight, they became non-citizens. But that was only the onset. The second decree, issued later that year, commanded the detention of all Christian leaders, bishops, priests, deacons, any in command. The jails overflowed so rapidly that regular offenders were freed to accommodate these faith-based captives. And Nicholas, as Myra's bishop, was directly targeted. Try to picture what that arrest might have felt like. Perhaps it occurred at night, Roman troops hammering on his home's door, flames flickering in the shadows, or maybe they seized him in daylight, pulling him from his church as his followers looked on in terror. We don't have the exact particulars. What we do have are later descriptions by Greek chroniclers who state that the Holy Nicholas was captured by officials, tormented, then shackled and imprisoned alongside numerous other Christians. Tormented. Let that term linger with you briefly. Roman torment wasn't meant to gather information. It was intended to shatter individuals. Bodily, certainly, but more vitally, mentally. The aim was to force you to forsake your religion, to burn incense before the emperor's image, to demonstrate your devotion to Rome. Typical techniques included whipping with straps laced with metal or bone, pulling on the rack until limbs dislocated, searing with heated irons. And these weren't conducted privately. They were open displays meant to frighten anyone considering defying Roman rule. Did Nicholas suffer these exact torments? We can't affirm definitively, but we know he was jailed, and we know that jail time under Diocletian wasn't passive. You were expected to endure. Let me describe what a Roman prison really resembled, because I believe this matters. We're not discussing modern facilities with cells and meal times and visitor periods. A Roman prison, particularly for political or religious detainees, was frequently just a cavity in the earth, literally. They were termed Tullianum in Latin, after the most notorious one in Rome. These locations were pitch black, not dim, but utter darkness. No openings, no sunlight. You might receive a torch or oil light if fortunate, but usually you lingered in total obscurity. The atmosphere was heavy with the odor of waste since there were no restrooms, no plumbing, just a hole or perhaps a spot where many relieved themselves. Temperatures swung dramatically. In summer, it was stifling. In winter, and yes, even Mediterranean winters, chill you shivered. You received scarcely enough sustenance to live. Stale bread, diluted gruel, occasionally nothing for days. And the mental torment was harsher than the physical. You didn't know when or if you'd escape. You didn't know if today they'd pull you out and kill you. You heard cries from other sections of the prison. You heard pleas. You heard quiet when someone finally surrendered and perished. This was Nicholas's reality for months, possibly years. And yet, and this is the aspect that moves me, he survived, not merely physically, but in spirit. The subsequent accounts describe how he kept supporting his fellow inmates, that he worshipped with them, uplifted them, kept them united when all appeared hopeless. Consider the resilience that demanded not otherworldly resilience, but profoundly human resilience, the type that stems from choosing repeatedly each day that your convictions merit the agony. Now, here's where the narrative takes a surprising direction. Because while Nicholas languished in prison, something was unfolding on the empire's opposite side that would alter everything. A figure named Constantine was ascending to authority. Constantine's saga is astonishing on its own. Too intricate to cover fully here, but the brief summary is this. He was a military leader who battled his way to co-emperor. And in 312 AD, the year prior to legalizing Christianity, Constantine asserted he experienced a vision before a key conflict. He beheld a luminous cross in the heavens with the phrase, "In this sign, conquer." Whether that vision truly occurred, or Constantine was a shrewd political mind who sensed the shifting tides, that's a discussion for later. What counts is that in 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which formally halted the oppression of Christians. Suddenly, Christianity wasn't illegal anymore. The prison gates opened. Nicholas, along with innumerable other clergy, stepped free. Can you envision that instant? You've been in gloom for years. You've seen companions die. You've been struck, starved, humiliated. You have every justification to be shattered, resentful, ruined. And then one day, the wardens arrive and announce, "You're free to leave." What do you do then? How do you handle it? How do you resume ordinary life after such an ordeal? Here's what captivates me about Nicholas's life after prison. He returned straight to his bishop duties. He didn't withdraw to a cloister for recovery. He didn't turn bitter or isolated. He went back to Myra and resumed leading his flock. And this is where I believe the true essence of the man shines through, because it would have been so simple to grow callous, to view the world as hopelessly wicked, to concentrate only on safeguarding yourself and yours. But the stories we have again, composed later but persistent, depict a different image. They portray a man who grew more giving, more understanding, more eager to step in for the defenseless. There's a well-known tale, noted by later Byzantine scholars, about Nicholas rescuing 3 innocent men from death. The narrative states that 3 military officers were wrongly charged with treason and condemned to execution. The evening before their beheading, Nicholas visited Emperor Constantine in a dream, insisting on their freedom. The governor experienced the same dream. When they shared notes the next day, they were so rattled that they released the captives and dispatched them to Nicholas with a message requesting his prayers for tranquility. Now, is that tale literally accurate? Likely not. Dream appearances are a frequent motif in ancient saint biographies. These are the sorts of miraculous accounts affixed to saints to illustrate their sanctity and link to the divine. But here's what I believe the tale uncovers. Even hundreds of years later, people linked Nicholas with fairness, with advocating for the blameless, with employing whatever influence he possessed, worldly or spiritual, to shield those unable to shield themselves. And that link didn't emerge from nothing. It had to stem from some authentic conduct pattern that folks recalled. Let me pose this to you. Have you ever observed how trauma can branch in two directions? Some folks who endure hardship resolve that nobody else should face what they did. Others conclude that all should suffer as they did. Nicholas, it appears, took the former path. His imprisonment didn't render him harsh, it made him compassionate. There's a mental concept here that I find truly compelling. It's termed post-traumatic growth. The notion that occasionally enduring awful events can in fact make you tougher, more empathetic, more sensitive to others' pain. Not invariably, naturally. Trauma can equally devastate you. But when it doesn't, when you emerge intact, you possess a sort of ethical credibility that others lack. You've witnessed humanity's worst and opted to reply with humanity's best. I think that's what occurred with Nicholas, and I think that's why his narrative struck such a chord with people in the ensuing centuries. He wasn't some invulnerable saint who never hurt. He was a man broken by the empire who chose to respond not with revenge, but with liberality. That is a revolutionary deed. Now, there's one additional facet of Nicholas's imprisonment that I want to cover before progressing. And it's somewhat darker, somewhat more uneasy, but I believe it's essential. Not all survived. For each Nicholas who exited prison, there were dozens, hundreds who didn't, who succumbed to illness, hunger, torment, who cracked under pressure and renounced their beliefs to halt the agony, who were killed in public areas as cautions to others. The early church labeled these individuals martyrs, and they were honored nearly as much as saints. But here's the point. Martyrdom wasn't glorious, it was gruesome and savage and frightening. The people who perished weren't heroes in gleaming armor. They were everyday men and women driven to the utmost edge of human tolerance and unable to endure it. Nicholas endured. And I don't think that makes him superior to those who didn't. I think it makes him fortunate, or blessed, if you like. But in either case, his survival wasn't assured. It hinged on 1,000 elements outside his influence: the caprices of his guards, the empire's path, the basic biological chance of who catches which sickness in a dirty cell. So when we recount Nicholas's story, I think we must maintain that balance. Yes, applaud his valor. Yes, respect his endurance, but also recall those who didn't succeed, the unnamed detainees forgotten by history, the ones whose bones turned to powder in unmarked burials. Because Nicholas's story isn't solely about one man's victory. It's about the price, what it perpetually costs to stand for something when the world insists you stand for nothing. And here's the concluding reflection I want to share with you on this phase of his life. When Nicholas stepped out of that prison in 313 AD, he stepped into a radically different world. Christianity transitioned from a persecuted fringe faith to, in mere decades, the official religion of the Roman Empire. Churches arose, clergy acquired power and sway. The belief once practiced covertly in underground tunnels and home gatherings was now honored in grand basilicas with imperial support. Nicholas experienced that shift. He saw the church move from hidden to mainstream, from revolutionary to established. And that shift brought its own issues, its own corruptions, its own trials. Because when you're no longer battling for existence, when you're no longer the outsider, what do you battle for? How do you preserve the purity of your initial purpose when emperors are now your sponsors? These are inquiries that would define the remainder of Nicholas's life and the Church's life for centuries ahead. And we're going to examine them thoroughly as we proceed with this adventure. But first, we need to discuss one of the most renowned and most debated stories ever linked to Nicholas. A story that might be utter invention, that might be inflated truth, but that discloses something profound about how legends form and why they count. We're going to discuss the Council of Nicaea, the assembly of bishops that outlined Christian orthodoxy for the next 2,000 years, and the dramatic assertion that Nicholas wasn't merely present, but that he struck one of the most infamous heretics in Christian history across the face. Did it truly occur? Was Nicholas even at the council? And what does it reveal about the gap between the man and the myth? Hang in there with me, because this is where things get truly captivating. There's a point in history, or perhaps in legend, we can't be completely certain, that perfectly embodies the clash between belief and rage, between commitment and aggression, between the saint we desire Nicholas to be and the imperfect, fervent human he likely was. The year is 325 A.D. The setting is Nicaea, a town in what's now northwestern Turkey. Within a majestic palace chamber, 318 bishops have convened from throughout the Roman Empire for what would emerge as one of the most impactful religious assemblies in human annals. The atmosphere is dense with incense, strain, and the gravity of choices that will mold Christianity for the following 2 millennia. And somewhere in that space, according to a narrative passed down for centuries, Bishop Nicholas of Myra approached a priest named Arius and smacked him across the cheek. Now, before you envision Santa Claus in a brawl, and yes, I know that's amusing, we need to pose a vital query. Did this really take place? Was Nicholas even there? And if not, why do folks still recount this as if it were absolute truth? Because here's the deal. This is where the legend of St. Nicholas truly begins to diverge from the historical evidence, and grasping why is utterly essential if we aim to uncover the true individual beneath the folklore. Let's begin with what we know definitively about the Council of Nicaea. In the spring of 325 A.D., Emperor Constantine, the same Constantine who'd ended Christian persecution merely 12 years prior, summoned a vast meeting of Christian bishops. His objective, to resolve a doctrinal disagreement that was ripping the church apart. The disagreement focused on a priest from Alexandria named Arius. Arius was charming, learned, and fully persuaded he deciphered the authentic nature of Jesus Christ. Per Arius, Jesus wasn't co-eternal with God the Father. Rather, Jesus was God's foremost and greatest creation, divine, yes, but created. There was an era, Arius contended, when the Son didn't exist. To contemporary listeners, this might seem like nitpicking, but in the 4th century, this was dynamite, because if Jesus was created, he wasn't fully God. And if he wasn't fully God, the whole bedrock of Christian doctrine, the concept that God himself had incarnated to redeem humanity, collapsed. The counterview, promoted by a deacon named Athanasius, maintained that Jesus was homoousios with the Father, a Greek term signifying of the same essence. Father and Son weren't merely alike, they were essentially, ontologically the same. Jesus was completely God, eternally coexisting with the Father. Constantine didn't especially care who prevailed. He was a statesman, not a theologian. What he cared about was cohesion. He required the church cohesive because he required the empire cohesive. Religious splits led to social disorder, and social disorder led to instability. So he assembled the bishops, supplied the site, covered the costs, and basically said, "Sort this out." Here's where it becomes intriguing. We have rosters of participants from the Council of Nicaea. Several rosters, in fact, assembled by various historians in the years and centuries after the council. And here's the issue. Nicholas's name isn't on any of the earliest, most dependable rosters. Not a single one. The roster compiled by Athanasius himself, no Nicholas. The roster from Eusebius of Caesarea, who attended the council and wrote extensively about it, no Nicholas. Even later rosters from the 5th and 6th centuries, when St. Nicholas's veneration was already thriving, don't reference him. So if Nicholas wasn't present, where did the smacking story originate? It surfaces initially in documents from the 14th century. A full 1,000 years post-council, 1,000 years. That's like us today narrating events from 1025 and treating them as direct reports. The story, as it eventually solidified, unfolds like this. During the council discussions, Arius rose and shared his opinions. Nicholas, unable to hold back his righteous anger at what he saw as sacrilege, sprang from his seat, marched across the room, and hit Arius on the face. The other bishops were appalled. Some accounts say Nicholas was divested of his bishop's attire and briefly jailed. Other accounts say Jesus and Mary visited his cell that night, restored his garments, and absolved him. It's a spectacular tale, full of drama and intensity. It portrays a saint so ardent about truth that he couldn't restrain himself, even if it meant violating etiquette and risking penalty. But it's almost surely made up. Now, before you get disappointed, let me explain why this story is actually more captivating as fiction than as fact. Because what we're observing here is legend formation happening live. We can trace how a narrative gets linked to a renowned figure, how it develops, how it fulfills a role even when it's not historically precise. Think about it. By the 14th century, when this story first shows up, Nicholas had been a cherished saint for centuries. Churches throughout Europe bore his name. People invoked him in prayers. Monarchs sought his safeguard. But who was he truly? What set him apart? The early sources didn't provide much material. We knew he was a bishop. We knew he was generous. We knew he endured persecution. But that applied to many early Christian figures. Nicholas required something extra, something to distinguish him, something to make him not merely holy but heroic. Enter the smacking story. Abruptly, Nicholas wasn't just a passive victim. He was an active guardian of doctrine. He was ready to hazard everything, his standing, his role, his liberty, to defend what he deemed true. He was a figure of action, of zeal, of ethical clarity. And here's the brilliance of the story. It makes Nicholas relatable because who hasn't at times wanted to smack someone spouting what we consider harmful rubbish? Who hasn't experienced that rush of justified fury when faced with notions we find profoundly mistaken? The story suggests even saints lose their temper. Even sacred people are human. And that, ironically, makes Nicholas more saintly, not less. But there's another dimension to this, and it's a touch more shadowy, a touch more strategic. The 14th century, when this story arose, was an era of fierce doctrinal strife in the Church. There were arguments about papal power, about the Eucharist's nature, about Scripture versus custom. And amid these arguments, people needed past examples. They needed champions from history who could legitimize their current stances. So stories were created or embellished or re-envisioned, not always with bad intent, but with the honest conviction that these narratives captured a deeper reality, even if factually inaccurate. This is what historians term sacred history, a method of narrating the past less focused on what truly occurred and more on what ought to have occurred, what must have occurred for the universe's moral framework to align. And frankly, sacred history isn't unique to Christianity. Every society does it. We do it today. We recount tales about George Washington felling a cherry tree and confessing he can't lie. Except the tale is pure invention, crafted decades after Washington's death to instruct kids on honesty. We recount tales about Abraham Lincoln trekking miles to repay a few cents, tales that likely never happened, but that embody something we hold true about his personality. The Nicholas smacking story is the medieval equivalent. It's not history, it's hagiography. And hagiography has a different aim than history. So let me ask you this, does it count? Does it count that Nicholas probably wasn't at Nicaea, that he probably never smacked Arius, that this entire dramatic episode is likely the creation of authors a millennium later? I think it counts a great deal, but perhaps not how you'd predict. It counts because it instructs us to be discerning consumers of narratives, to inquire about information's origins, to differentiate between this is what people claim happened and this is what the proof shows happened. Those aren't identical, and mixing them causes all sorts of issues. But here's the counterpoint. Realizing the smacking story is fiction doesn't render it valueless, because fiction can disclose truth. The reality that people wanted to believe Nicholas was at Nicaea, that he opposed heresy, that he was ready to act despite the cost, that reveals something authentic about what Nicholas signified to people, about the principles he stood for, about the type of saint he became in the shared mind. And that shared mind that's potent. It molds societies. It affects how millions comprehend generosity, bravery, faith. So in an odd way, the fictional Nicholas, the Nicholas of legend, has been more impactful than the historical Nicholas could ever be. Because the historical Nicholas was just one individual confined to one time and place, but the legendary Nicholas, he belongs to all. He can be modified, re-explained, re-envisioned to address fresh situations and fresh challenges. That's the peculiar magic of sainthood. The individual turns into a symbol. The symbol becomes more tangible than the individual, and ultimately the symbol gains its own vitality. Let me offer a contemporary parallel. Consider how we recall Martin Luther King Jr. nowadays. Most know him for the "I Have a Dream" speech. They know the polished, uplifting version, the peaceful visionary of racial unity. But the real Martin Luther King was far more nuanced. He opposed the Vietnam War. He pushed for economic redistribution. He was monitored by the FBI, who deemed him a threat. In his final years, his approval ratings were low. Most white Americans disapproved of him, but over time, that complicated, controversial figure was softened. He became a symbol. And now, individuals who would have resisted him during his life cite him to bolster their own causes. They quote him selectively. They overlook the uncomfortable parts. Is that incorrect? Not necessarily. Symbols develop. That's their nature. Nicholas of Myra, the real human, was probably a devoted bishop who performed some remarkable charitable deeds and suffered under Roman oppression. That's impressive in itself. But Saint Nicholas, the legend, the symbol, he's something altogether different. He's the patron saint of mariners, kids, traders, pawnbrokers, voyagers. He's the orthodoxy defender who smacked a heretic. He's the covert gift giver who inspired Santa Claus. He's a canvas on which innumerable cultures have projected their own ideals and hopes. And here's the lovely, exasperating truth. We'll never fully disentangle the person from the symbol. The historical evidence is too sparse. The legends are too dense. The span of time is too vast. But we can examine the stories critically. We can pose difficult questions. We can separate what we know from what we assume we know. And in doing that, we might discover that the real Nicholas, flawed, human, limited, is more intriguing than the flawless saint could ever be. So what about the Council of Nicaea itself? What really transpired there? The bishops debated for weeks. Arius presented his arguments. Athanasius responded with his own. Constantine, growing impatient, eventually supported the Athanasian stance. The council crafted the Nicene Creed, a faith declaration that proclaimed Jesus as God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, of one being with the Father. Arianism was denounced, Arius was banished, and the form of Christianity we recognize today, the one declaring Jesus fully divine, became the standard. It was a turning point, one of history's pivots, and whether Nicholas was there or not, whether he smacked anyone or not, doesn't alter the event's importance. What it does alter is our grasp of how legends function, how they expand, how they serve roles unrelated to factual precision and entirely about crafting meaning. And as we keep unmasking the true saint, Nicholas, that's a lesson we'll need to remember, because the upcoming stories we're going to investigate, the accounts of miraculous gift-giving, of rescuing children from death, of shielding sailors from tempests, are every bit as complex, every bit as intertwined with legend as the smacking story. But they're also the stories that made Nicholas renowned, the stories that traversed oceans and centuries, the stories that ultimately reshaped a Mediterranean bishop into the cheerful man in red we know now. And to comprehend those stories, we need to return to Myra, back to the community Nicholas served, back to the specific acts of kindness that ignited the imagination of generations. Because here's what I think really happened. Nicholas probably did do something extraordinary. Not magical, not supernatural, but extraordinary in the very human sense of going beyond what was expected, of using his resources and influence to help people in desperate need. And those acts remembered and retold became the seeds from which the legend grew. Like a tiny mustard seed that becomes a great tree, the real acts of the real Nicholas grew into something vast and sprawling, something that would eventually shelter millions under its branches. So let's go there. Let's explore the stories of generosity that made Nicholas a saint in the first place. Let's examine the famous tale of the 3 daughters and the bags of gold. Let's ask what those stories tell us about the world Nicholas lived in, about the values he embodied, and about why those values still resonate today. Because if we're going to truly unmask Santa Claus, we need to understand not just who Nicholas was, but why his particular brand of kindness mattered so much that people are still talking about it 1,700 years later. And that's where we're headed next. Every legend has an origin story. Every myth begins with the seed of truth. And for Nicholas of Myra, that seed was planted one night when he allegedly threw a bag of gold through a window, and in doing so, changed the course of history in ways he could never have imagined. This is the story that made Nicholas famous. The story that has been painted by countless artists, retold in countless languages, adapted into countless variations. the story of the three daughters and the secret gift. And what makes it so powerful is not just what Nicholas did, but why he did it. Because to understand this act of generosity, we first need to understand the horror it was meant to prevent. We need to talk about what happened to poor girls in the Roman Empire when their families could not afford to marry them off. And I warn you, this gets dark. But it's important because the stakes of Nicholas's intervention were not abstract. They were life and death. They were dignity versus degradation. They were hope versus despair. So let's go back to Myra sometime in the early 4th century and meet a man whose name history has forgotten, but whose desperation would become immortal. Imagine you're a father in the Roman world. You have 3 daughters. You love them, of course, but love isn't enough because in the social structure of the time, daughters are both a blessing and an economic burden. They can't inherit property the way sons can. They can't work most jobs. Their primary value in the brutal calculus of Roman society is their marriageability. And marriage requires a dowry. Now let me explain what a dowry actually meant in this context, because I think a lot of us have a vague idea but don't really understand the mechanics. A dowry wasn't a gift to the groom. It was more like a security deposit. It was money or property that the bride's family provided to ensure that she would be cared for, that she would have some financial independence within the marriage, that she wouldn't be completely at the mercy of her husband. Without a dowry, a girl from a respectable family simply couldn't marry. No dowry meant no suitors, and no marriage meant, well, that's where things get really bleak. Because in the Roman Empire, an unmarried woman from a poor family had very limited options. She could try to find work as a servant, but those positions were scarce and poorly paid. She could become a prostitute, and yes, prostitution was legal and regulated in Rome, but it was also brutally exploitative, or in the worst-case scenario, she could be sold into slavery. And that's not hyperbole. That actually happened. Fathers who couldn't afford dowries sometimes sold their daughters to slave traders or brothel owners, rationalizing it as at least giving the girls a chance to survive, even if that survival came at a horrific cost. This was the reality facing the unnamed father in the Nicholas story. He had 3 daughters of marriageable age. He had no money for dowries, and he was, according to the legend, seriously contemplating selling them into prostitution because he saw no other choice. Can you imagine that level of desperation, that level of moral anguish, knowing that your own poverty might force you to destroy your daughters' lives? Now, here's where Nicholas enters the picture, according to the earliest versions of the story which appear in texts from the 9th and 10th centuries. So again, we're dealing with accounts written centuries after the fact. Nicholas heard about this family's plight, maybe through the network of his church, maybe just through local gossip. Small towns talk, after all. And Myra wasn't a huge city. And Nicholas, remember, was a young man at this point. He had recently inherited wealth from his parents. He had the means to help. But here's the crucial detail that makes this story so interesting. He chose to help secretly, not publicly, not in a way that would bring him honor or recognition. He didn't march up to the father's door with a bag of gold and say, "Here you go from your generous Bishop Nicholas." Instead, he waited until nightfall. He crept up to the house, and he threw a bag of gold, or in some versions, gold coins, through an open window. The bag landed, according to various tellings, either on the floor or in a shoe or in a stocking that had been hung by the fire to dry. That last detail, of course, is where we get the modern tradition of hanging stockings for Santa Claus. But we'll get to that evolution later. For now, focus on what happened next. The father woke up, or maybe he was still awake staring at the ceiling, tormented by impossible choices, and found the gold enough to provide a dowry for his eldest daughter, enough to change everything. The relief must have been overwhelming, miraculous even. Where did this come from? Who would do such a thing? The father had no idea, and that was exactly the point. Nicholas did it again for the second daughter, again in secret, again at night, again through the window. Another bag of gold, another life saved from a terrible fate. And then, and this is where the story gets really interesting, when it came time for the third daughter, the father decided he needed to know who his mysterious benefactor was. So he stayed up all night watching, waiting. And when Nicholas approached with the third bag of gold, the father rushed out and caught him in the act. Nicholas, embarrassed, reportedly begged the man not to tell anyone, to keep the gift secret. Some versions say he made the father swear an oath of silence. Other versions say the secret got out anyway, because honestly, how do you keep something like that quiet in a small community? Now, let's pause and analyze this story because there are layers here that are easy to miss if we just take it at face value. First, notice the emphasis on secrecy. Nicholas didn't want credit. He didn't want recognition. This is radically different from how most charitable giving worked in the Roman world, and honestly, how it still works today. In Roman society, wealthy patrons were expected to be ostentatiously generous. They built public baths and theaters with their names carved into the stone. They sponsored gladiatorial games and distributed grain to the poor in public ceremonies designed to showcase their munificence. Why? Because generosity was a form of social currency. It bought you influence, loyalty, political support. It was transactional. But Nicholas's generosity wasn't transactional. It was anonymous. It expected nothing in return, not even gratitude. Because if the recipients don't know who you are, they can't thank you. This is what theologians call pure charity, giving for its own sake, not for social gain. And in the context of 4th century Rome, that was genuinely unusual, almost countercultural. Second, notice what the gift actually accomplished. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. By providing dowries, Nicholas ensured that these young women could marry respectably, could remain free, could avoid the nightmare of sexual exploitation or slavery. He wasn't just solving an economic problem, he was preventing a moral catastrophe. And third, and this is subtle but important, the story centers on women, on female agency and female suffering. It takes seriously the idea that what happens to these daughters matters, that their fate is worth divine intervention, or at least saintly intervention. Now, you might think, well, of course it matters. They are human beings. But remember, we're talking about a society where women had virtually no legal rights, where they couldn't vote, couldn't hold property independently in most cases, couldn't testify in court with the same weight as men, where their primary social function was to produce legitimate heirs for their husbands. The fact that this story became the most famous story about Nicholas, more famous than anything he supposedly did for men, tells us something about the early Christian community that preserved and propagated it. It tells us that they valued the protection of vulnerable women, that they saw this as a holy act worth celebrating. And that's significant, because as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, one of its major appeals was precisely this. It offered women a kind of dignity and protection that pagan society often didn't. Women were prominent in the early church. They hosted house churches. They financially supported missionaries. They were deacons and prophets and martyrs. The Nicholas story taps into that tradition. It says, this is what a good Christian leader does. He protects the vulnerable. He uses his resources to prevent suffering. He does it quietly without fanfare because the act itself is the reward. But here's the million-dollar question. Did it actually happen? We don't know. We have no contemporary accounts. The story appears hundreds of years after Nicholas's death. It could be completely true. It could be partially true. Maybe Nicholas did help a poor family and the details got embellished over time. Or it could be entirely invented, a pious fiction designed to illustrate Christian virtues, using Nicholas as a convenient protagonist. Personally, I lean toward probably based on something real. Here's why the story is too specific, too grounded in the social realities of the time to be pure invention. Whoever first told this tale understood intimately how dowries worked, what the stakes were for poor families with daughters, what options existed and what options didn't. That suggests eyewitness knowledge, or at least knowledge passed down from people who lived in that world. It's not a generic miracle story. It's a very particular intervention in a very particular social problem. But even if we can't prove it happened, what matters is that people believed it happened. And they believed it not because they were gullible, but because it fit what they already knew about Nicholas's character. It was plausible. It was the kind of thing Nicholas would do. And that reputation, that consistent association with secret generosity, with helping people in desperate straits, had to come from somewhere. Reputations don't just appear out of nowhere. They are built through patterns of behavior over time. So maybe Nicholas didn't help exactly 3 daughters in exactly this way. But I'd bet good money that he helped people, a lot of people, in ways that were quiet, personal, and sacrificial. And those individual acts over years and decades accumulated into a legend. Let me tell you about a psychological phenomenon called the halo effect. It's the tendency for positive impressions in one area to influence our perceptions in other areas. If we think someone is kind, we're more likely to also assume they're honest, intelligent, trustworthy. Legends work the same way. Once Nicholas had a reputation for generosity, other stories of generosity got attached to him. Some might have been his. Some might have been done by other people but attributed to him. Some might have been invented to illustrate moral points. This isn't lying exactly. It's how oral cultures preserve values. They attach stories to memorable figures because those figures become teaching tools. Nicholas becomes a symbol of generosity. And any story about generosity can plausibly be a Nicholas story. But here's what I find beautiful about that. It means Nicholas succeeded in a way that transcends individual biography. He became an archetype. He became the answer to the question, what does Christian charity look like in practice? And that archetype was powerful enough to survive for 1,700 years, powerful enough to cross oceans and continents, powerful enough to eventually evolve into Santa Claus, a figure who at his core is still defined by one central act: giving gifts to children in secret, expecting nothing in return. Think about that. The connection between 4th century dowries and 21st century Christmas presents isn't arbitrary. It's a direct line. The gold thrown through the window became the coins in the stockings. The secret nighttime visit became the midnight ride on Christmas Eve. The concern for vulnerable daughters became the focus on children's happiness and well-being. The details changed, but the essence remained the same: generosity as an end in itself. giving without expecting reciprocation, using your resources, whatever they are, to bring joy or relief or hope to people who need it. Now, I want to address something that might be bothering you. You might be thinking, okay, but is it really that great that Nicholas helped these women by enabling them to get married? Isn't marriage just another form of confinement for women in that society? And yes, you're right. Marriage in the Roman world wasn't exactly a feminist paradise. Women were still legally subordinate to their husbands. They still had limited autonomy. They were still valued primarily for their reproductive capacity. But here's the thing. We can't judge historical actions by modern standards alone. We have to ask, given the options actually available at the time, was this action beneficial or harmful? And within the context of 4th century Rome, marriage was unquestionably preferable to slavery or forced prostitution. It offered legal protections, it offered social status, it offered the possibility of companionship of children of a household to manage. It wasn't perfect, but it was infinitely better than the alternatives. Nicholas didn't abolish patriarchy. He didn't revolutionize the social structure, but he worked within the system to produce the best possible outcome for these particular women in this particular situation. And that's all any of us can really do, right? We inherit imperfect systems. We do our best to reduce suffering within them. While maybe if we're ambitious, working toward larger structural change, Nicholas chose the immediate good over the abstract perfect. He saved 3 lives rather than waiting for society to become just. And I think there's wisdom in that. Social change is important, but so is helping the person in front of you right now. There's one more element of this story I want to explore before we move on, and it's the element of surprise, the element of unexpected rescue. Think about what it must have felt like for that father. He had resigned himself to a terrible choice. He had made peace with doing something unthinkable because he saw no alternative. And then suddenly, inexplicably, salvation arrived, literally overnight. That sense of reversal, of darkness turning to light, of despair turning to hope, of impossibility becoming reality, is at the heart of so many religious narratives. It's the Exodus story. It's the resurrection story. It's the theme of deliverance of God or God's agents intervening precisely when all seems lost. And whether or not you believe in divine intervention, you have to admit there's something deeply moving about the idea that help can come from unexpected quarters, that you're not as alone as you think, that someone somewhere might be paying attention to your suffering and might choose to do something about it. That's a powerful message, especially in a world that often feels indifferent to individual pain, especially when you're lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to solve an unsolvable problem. The Nicholas story says, maybe there's a way through. Maybe help will come. Maybe you shouldn't give up quite yet. And even if the story isn't literally true, the hope it offers is real. The possibility it represents is real. Because acts of unexpected kindness do happen. People do help strangers. Generosity does exist, not always, not reliably, but sometimes. And sometimes is enough to keep going. So here's where we are. Nicholas of Myra, whether through this specific act or through a pattern of similar acts, became known as someone who helped people in secret, who used his wealth and influence to prevent suffering, who took seriously the plight of the vulnerable, especially women and children. That reputation spread first through Myra, then through the region, then across the Christian world. And as it spread, it grew. New stories attached themselves to Nicholas like ornaments on a tree. Stories of other miracles, other interventions, other impossible rescues. And that's where we're headed next. Because the three daughters story is just the beginning, it's the foundation. But built on that foundation is a towering structure of legends, each one stranger and more fantastical than the last. We're going to explore the story of the three boys in the pickle barrel. A tale so gruesome, so bizarre that it almost defies belief. We're going to examine Nicholas's reputation as the protector of sailors, the patron saint of anyone who dares to venture out onto the unpredictable sea. We're going to look at the miracle of the wheat, the story of the wrongly accused officers, and a dozen other tales that turn Nicholas into something more than human. And as we do, we're going to keep asking the same questions. What is real? What is legend? And why do these stories persist even when we know they probably aren't factually accurate? Because that's the puzzle at the heart of this entire series. Nicholas was a man, but he became a myth. And somewhere in the space between those two things, between the historical person and the legendary saint, lies a truth about human nature, about hope, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of a chaotic world. So stay with me. We're about to dive into the Wonder Workers portfolio, and I promise you it's going to be wild. All right, I need to warn you about something. The story I'm about to tell you is disturbing, like genuinely unsettling. It involves murdered children, dismemberment, and a barrel of brine. And yet, for centuries, this was one of the most beloved stories about St. Nicholas. It was painted on church walls across Europe. It was told to children as a bedtime tale. It was acted out in medieval mystery plays. Which raises a fascinating question. What does it say about a culture when their favorite saint story involves resurrection from a pickle barrel? But before we get to the pickled children, and yes, I promise we will get there, we need to understand something crucial about how medieval people thought about saints. Because the Nicholas who emerged in the Middle Ages wasn't just a generous bishop. He was a wonder worker, a miracle machine, someone who bent the laws of nature as casually as you or I might bend a paperclip. And the thing is, people needed him to be that way. They needed miracles, not because they were stupid or superstitious, but because they lived in a world that was brutal, unpredictable, and often terrifyingly random. A world where you could do everything right and still lose everything. Where children died of diseases we can now cure with antibiotics. Where a bad harvest meant starvation. Where a storm at sea meant death. In that world, miracles weren't optional. They were oxygen. Let's start with the sea, because that's where Nicholas's reputation as a miracle worker really took off quite literally. According to legends that began circulating in the 6th and 7th centuries, Nicholas became the patron saint of sailors after he calmed a storm that threatened to sink a ship. The story goes like this. Nicholas was traveling to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage. This would have been sometime in his younger years before he became bishop. The Mediterranean was relatively calm when they set out, but anyone who knows the sea knows it can turn violent without warning. And apparently it did. Waves towered over the deck. Wind shredded the sails. The ship pitched and rolled, water pouring over the sides. Experienced sailors, men who had spent their entire lives on the water, were terrified. This was the kind of storm that sank ships and drowned entire crews, and Nicholas, according to the legend, simply stood up and rebuked the waves, commanded the storm to stop, and it did just like that. Instant calm. Now, if you grew up Christian, that story probably sounds familiar because it's essentially the same miracle Jesus performed in the Gospels when he calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Same setup, same resolution, same demonstration of power over nature. And that's not a coincidence. Medieval hagiographers, the people who wrote saints' lives, deliberately modeled their stories on biblical narratives. It was a way of saying this person is so holy, so close to God, that they can do what Jesus did. It was the ultimate endorsement. But here's what's interesting. Sailors believed it. For centuries, sailors across the Mediterranean and beyond prayed to St. Nicholas before voyages. They painted his image on their ships. They carried relics of him as protective talismans. When they survived storms, they credited Nicholas. When they didn't, well, the dead don't file complaints. And you know what? Maybe the story isn't literally true. Maybe Nicholas never actually calmed a storm. But the fact that sailors adopted him as their patron saint tells us something real. Nicholas represented safety, protection, the hope that someone was watching over you when you ventured into spaces where human control ended and nature's chaos began. That's a real need. That's a real fear. And Nicholas, whether through actual miracles or through the power of his reputation, addressed it. But the storm story is tame compared to what comes next. So let me ask you, how far can a legend stretch before it snaps? How bizarre can a miracle story get before people stop believing it? Because we're about to find out. The story of the three boys and the butcher appears in various forms across medieval Europe. But the core narrative goes like this. There was a terrible famine in the region around Myra. Food was scarce. People were desperate, and in the middle of this crisis, three young boys, sources differ on their ages, but usually somewhere between 7 and 12, were traveling. Maybe they were looking for food, maybe they were lost. The details vary. They came to an inn run by a butcher. They asked for shelter, for food. And the butcher, who in some versions is explicitly described as evil, and in other versions is just pragmatically responding to the famine, made a calculation. He killed the three boys, butchered their bodies, and placed the pieces in a barrel of brine, essentially pickling them like pork, intending to sell the meat to unsuspecting travelers. I told you this was dark, but it gets stranger. Nicholas somehow learned of this crime. Different versions explain his knowledge differently. Some say he had a vision. Others say he simply deduced it. Others say an angel told him. Regardless, Nicholas showed up at the inn, confronted the butcher, and then performed the most improbable miracle in his entire portfolio. He reassembled the boys from the barrel, blessed them, and brought them back to life, fully restored, completely healthy, as if nothing had happened. The boys woke up, climbed out the barrel, and presumably needed serious therapy. The butcher repented. Nicholas forgave him. Everyone lived happily ever after except for the collective psyche of medieval Europe, which apparently thought this was a great story to tell children. Okay, so what are we supposed to do with this? Because on one level, it's clearly absurd. People don't come back from being dismembered and pickled. That's not how biology works. That's not how death works. This isn't a miracle. This is a horror movie plot with a happy ending tacked on. But before we dismiss it entirely, let's try to understand what this story was doing for the people who told it and believed it. First, notice the context. Famine. This story emerged during or shortly after periods of severe food scarcity. And famines in the medieval world weren't like modern food insecurity. They were apocalyptic. They killed entire communities. They drove people to desperate, horrifying acts. There are documented cases from medieval famines of cannibalism, of parents abandoning children because they couldn't feed them, of social order completely breaking down. A survival instinct overrode every moral consideration. So the story of the butcher who kills children and tries to sell their flesh as meat isn't pulled from nowhere. It's a nightmare scenario, yes, but it's a nightmare rooted in genuine fear. It's the worst-case manifestation of what famine could drive people to do. And Nicholas's intervention in the story represents the restoration of moral order. It says, even when the world descends into cannibalistic chaos, there's still hope. There's still divine power that can reverse the irreversible, that can bring life from death, that can restore innocence destroyed by adult evil. That's a powerful message. If you're living in a world where children actually do die from starvation, where the systems meant to protect them fail, where the adults around them sometimes make monstrous choices. But there's another layer here that I find even more interesting. In art history, this story becomes a kind of visual shorthand for Nicholas's identity. If you walk through medieval European churches and see a painting of a man in bishop's robes standing next to a barrel with three small figures emerging from it, you immediately know that's Saint Nicholas. The image is iconic, distinctive, memorable, and that matters because in an era of widespread illiteracy, visual storytelling was how you communicated religious ideas. The pickle barrel scene became Nicholas's trademark, his logo. But why this story? Why not the dowry story, which is less horrifying and more obviously virtuous? I think it's because the pickle barrel story does something the dowry story doesn't. It demonstrates power over death itself. It's not just generosity, it's not just compassion, it's supernatural intervention at the most fundamental level. It's Nicholas saying, or rather medieval people saying through Nicholas, that God's power extends even into the grave, even into violent death, even into the most hopeless situations imaginable. Resurrection is the ultimate miracle. It's what separates the merely good from the truly divine. And by associating Nicholas with resurrection, medieval Christians were placing him in the same category as the very few biblical figures who performed that miracle. It's theological fan fiction at its finest. Now, let me tell you about a completely different kind of Nicholas miracle, because the Wonder Worker portfolio is nothing if not diverse. This one involves grain, geopolitics, and a healthy dose of economic savvy. The story goes that a fleet of ships loaded with grain was passing through the port of Myra, bound for the emperor in Constantinople. The region around Myra was experiencing severe food shortages. Again, with the famines, these really were a recurring nightmare, and the people were starving. Nicholas approached the captains of the grain ships and asked them to unload a portion of their cargo to feed the people of Myra. The captains refused. They had been commissioned to deliver a specific amount of grain to the emperor, they explained. If they arrived short, they would be executed for theft or incompetence. Every single grain had been measured and recorded. They couldn't afford to be even a little bit off. And Nicholas, according to the legend, said something like, "Trust me, unload what the people need. When you arrive in Constantinople, you'll find your cargo is still complete. Not a single measure will be missing." So the captains, either because they believed him or because a bishop's request was hard to refuse, did as he asked. They unloaded enough grain to feed Myra for years. Some versions say 2 years, others say more. The people rejoiced, the famine was averted, and when the ships reached Constantinople and the cargo was measured, it was exactly the amount that had been originally loaded down to the last grain. The emperor received his full shipment. The captains weren't executed. Nicholas had somehow multiplied the grain or protected it from decreasing or performed whatever mathematical miracle was necessary to make the numbers work. Now, here's what I love about this story. It's a miracle, yes, but it's also incredibly practical. Nicholas isn't just performing supernatural stunts for the sake of demonstrating holiness. He's solving a real problem: hunger, in a way that doesn't create new problems for anyone else. The people of Myra get fed. The emperor gets his grain. The sailors keep their heads. Everyone wins. And that to me suggests something about how Nicholas was remembered not just as powerful, but as wise, as someone who understood that miracles are most meaningful when they address concrete needs without causing collateral damage. Compare this to some other miracle stories from the medieval period where saints strike people dead for minor offenses, or cause enemies to go blind, or generally use supernatural power in petty vindictive ways. Nicholas's miracles, by contrast, are almost always protective or restorative. He saves, he heals, he provides. He doesn't punish. Well, except for the occasional heretic slapping, but we've already established that probably didn't happen. The point is, the character that emerges from these legends, even the absurd ones, is fundamentally benevolent. Nicholas uses power to help, not to harm. And that consistency across hundreds of different stories from different regions and time periods suggests it reflects something about the historical person's reputation. People remembered Nicholas as kind as someone who could be trusted with power because he wouldn't abuse it. And in a world where power was more often used to oppress than to liberate. That was genuinely remarkable. Let me bring this back to something we can relate to in our modern context. Think about the stories we tell about our heroes today. Superhero movies, for instance. What separates the heroes from the villains? Usually, it's not the power itself. Both sides have superpowers. It's how they use that power. Heroes use it to protect. Villains use it to dominate. Heroes sacrifice. Villains exploit. The Nicholas legends are doing the same thing. They're establishing moral categories through narrative. They're saying this is what good power looks like. This is how someone with resources and influence should behave. And in a society where bishops actually did have significant political and economic power, they controlled church property. They mediated disputes. They had the ear of local rulers. Stories about how a good bishop should use that power weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals. Young clergy in training would hear these stories and internalize the message. Be like Nicholas. Use your position to protect the vulnerable. Intervene when you see injustice. Be generous. Be brave. Be willing to take personal risks to help others. Whether Nicholas actually performed miracles is almost beside the point. What matters is that his legend became a template for Christian leadership, a model to aspire to. And that model was compelling enough to spread across the entire Christian world. From Greece to Russia to Western Europe, Nicholas became one of the most universally beloved saints. Churches were dedicated to him, feast days were celebrated, relics were treasured. By the time of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, just 200 years after Nicholas's death, there was already a church built in his honor in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. That's remarkably fast for a local bishop from a relatively minor city to achieve imperial recognition. Something about Nicholas resonated deeply with people, and I think it was precisely this combination of power and compassion, of supernatural ability and practical help, of being simultaneously awe-inspiring and accessible. But here's the uncomfortable question we have to ask. If most of these miracle stories are probably invented or heavily embellished, are we just talking about a fictional character? Is St. Nicholas essentially a religious superhero with no more historical validity than Batman? I don't think so. And here's why. Even fictional stories have to be plausible to their audiences. If I started telling stories about Nicholas performing miracles that contradicted what people knew about his character, those stories wouldn't spread. They'd be rejected as inauthentic. The fact that certain types of stories stuck, stories about generosity, protection, feeding the hungry, saving the innocent, while other types of stories didn't, tells us that there was some underlying reality constraining the legend. Some core of genuine reputation that news stories had to be consistent with. It's like how apocryphal Abraham Lincoln quotes have to at least sound like something Lincoln might have said. They have to fit the persona even if they're invented. The persona itself acts as a filter rejecting things that don't belong. So when we look at the Nicholas legends, we can extract a probable truth. This was someone known for using his resources to help people. Someone who was particularly attentive to the needs of children and the poor. Someone who was remembered fondly enough that people wanted to tell stories about him for centuries after his death. The specific miracles might be fiction, but the reputation for kindness that made those miracles narratively plausible, that was probably real. And that brings us to the next critical moment in the Nicholas story. Because all of these legends, the storms, the pickle barrel, the grain multiplication, were still just regional folklore for the first few centuries after his death. Nicholas was beloved, yes, but primarily in the eastern Mediterranean and parts of Greece. But then something happened that would transform Nicholas from a regional saint into a global phenomenon. Something dramatic, something that involved theft, international intrigue, and a midnight raid on a tomb. Because in 1087 AD, Italian sailors from the city of Bari decided they needed to possess the physical remains of St. Nicholas, and they were willing to break into his tomb, fight off local guardians, and smuggle his bones across the sea to make it happen. This event, known as the Translation of St. Nicholas, is one of the most audacious relic thefts in medieval history. And it changed everything because once Nicholas's bones arrived in Italy, his cult exploded across Western Europe. Suddenly, he wasn't just an Eastern saint, he was everyone's saint. And the bones themselves, the actual physical remains that sailors stole that night in 1087, those bones are still in Italy today. They've been examined, measured, studied, even subjected to modern forensic analysis. And the results, they're absolutely fascinating because they suggest that whoever is buried in that tomb in Bari really was a man from the 4th century, really was about 70 years old when he died, really does match the basic profile of Bishop Nicholas of Myra. So, in the next part, we're going to explore that remarkable story, the theft, the journey, the scientific examination, the strange phenomenon of the manna that supposedly oozes from Nicholas's bones, and what all of this tells us about the blurry line between faith, history, and the very human need to make the sacred tangible. Because if you want to unmask Santa Claus, you eventually have to deal with Santa's bones. And trust me, that's a story you don't want to miss. What happens to a legend when it dies? I mean that literally. Nicholas of Myra was a real person who at some point around the year 343 AD stopped breathing. His heart stopped beating. His body began the inevitable process of decay that claims every human being, no matter how holy. And in that moment, he transitioned from being a living bishop to being a corpse. But here's the strange thing. For Nicholas, death wasn't the end of his story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Because what happened to his body after death, where it was buried, how it was venerated, what people believed it could do would shape Christian culture for the next 1700 years, and counting. So let's talk about death, about bones, about the weird, wonderful, and sometimes creepy ways that medieval Christians related to the physical remains of their saints. Because if we want to understand how a 4th century bishop became Santa Claus, we need to understand the journey his skeleton took. And trust me, it's one strange trip. According to the most reliable traditions we have, Nicholas died in Myra around 343 AD. Some sources say December 6th, which is why that date became his feast day. Others suggest he might have died on December 3rd. The exact date is fuzzy, but the year seems relatively solid. He would have been in his 70s, ancient by 4th century standards, when life expectancy was maybe 40 years if you were lucky. The fact that Nicholas lived into his 70s suggests he was either blessed with good genes or he had access to better nutrition and health care than most people. Or both. When he died, he was buried in his own cathedral in Myra. This was standard practice for bishops. Your church wasn't just your workplace, it was your final resting place. And for someone as beloved as Nicholas apparently was, the burial would have been a significant event. Mourners from across the region, prayers and hymns, the whole community coming together to honor their spiritual leader. His body would have been wrapped in linen, anointed with oils and spices, and placed in a stone sarcophagus, essentially a coffin carved from marble or limestone. These weren't airtight, they were porous, which means that over time, moisture could seep in, organic matter could decay, the body would slowly reduce to bones, and then something strange started happening. Or at least people started claiming something strange was happening. The earliest reports, and we're talking about accounts from the 6th century, roughly 200 years after Nicholas's death, describe a sweet-smelling liquid seeping from his tomb. They called it manna, borrowing the biblical term for the miraculous food that sustained the Israelites in the desert. Other sources called it myrrh after the aromatic resin used in ancient embalming. This liquid was said to smell like roses. It was clear, watery, and people believed it had healing properties. Pilgrims would collect it in small vials. They'd dab it on sick relatives. They'd drink it, use it to bless their homes, carry it as protection against evil. Now, before we go any further, let me ask you, what do you think was actually happening? Because there are really only two possibilities here, right? Either this was a genuine miracle, supernatural liquid produced by holy bones, or there was a natural explanation that people interpreted as miraculous. And here's the fascinating thing. We actually know the answer, because in 1925, scientists at the University of Bari in Italy analyzed samples of the manna, and they discovered something that probably won't surprise you, but apparently shocked a lot of believers at the time. It's water, just water, H2O. Nothing magical about its chemical composition at all. But here's where it gets interesting. Where was the water coming from, and why did it have that distinctive smell? The most likely explanation involves basic geology and microbiology. Myra was, and still is, a coastal city. The water table is relatively high. Stone tombs, especially those underground or partially underground, are prone to condensation. Moisture from the surrounding soil seeps through the porous stone. It accumulates, it drips, and the smell that probably came from the aromatic oils and resins used in the original burial preparation, which would have permeated the stone over time, or from certain types of bacteria that can produce sweet-smelling compounds as they break down organic matter, or from minerals in the groundwater reacting with the limestone of the tomb. In other words, perfectly natural processes that would have seemed miraculous to people who didn't understand condensation, microbiology, or chemical reactions. But, and this is crucial, understanding the natural mechanism doesn't necessarily make the phenomenon less meaningful to believers, because for them the question wasn't, how is this happening, but rather, why is this happening here and not in other tombs? And that's actually a fair question. Not every saint's tomb produced manna. Not every burial site had this phenomenon. So what made Nicholas's tomb special? Maybe it was just the particular combination of location, stone composition, and moisture levels. Or maybe, and this is what believers would argue, God chose to manifest this sign at this particular tomb for this particular saint as a way of validating his holiness. Science can explain the mechanism. It can't definitively answer the why question, at least not in a way that would satisfy everyone. What we know for certain is that the manna became a huge deal. It turned Nicholas's tomb into one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in the Christian world. People traveled hundreds of miles on foot, on horseback, on ships to visit the cathedral in Myra and collect a vial of this miraculous liquid. And where there are pilgrims, there's money. Lots of money. Pilgrimage in the medieval world was big business. Pilgrims needed places to stay, food to eat, guides to show them around. They bought souvenirs, little lead or pewter badges showing images of the saint, which they'd pin to their clothing as proof that they'd made the journey. They made donations to the church. They purchased indulgences. The church in Myra would have become wealthy from this pilgrim trade, which meant the city itself would have prospered. Nicholas, even in death, was supporting his community economically, but it also meant that Nicholas's remains became a target, because in the medieval logic of relics, proximity to the saint's body equaled access to miraculous power. And if you could somehow acquire that body, you could redirect all of that pilgrim traffic and all of that money to your own city. This is where things get morally complicated, because we're about to talk about theft, grave robbery, the violation of a tomb that had been sacred for 700 years. And the perpetrators, they weren't villains in their own eyes. They were heroes on a holy mission. At least that's what they told themselves. Let me set the scene for you. The year is 1071 AD. The Seljuk Turks, a Muslim dynasty expanding westward from Central Asia, have just conquered much of Anatolia, including the region around Myra. The Byzantine Empire, which had controlled this territory for centuries, is in retreat. Christian communities are suddenly under Muslim rule. Now, to be fair, the Seljuks were generally tolerant of Christians and Jews. They allowed them to practice their religions, maintain their churches, go about their lives. This wasn't a genocidal conquest, but it was a conquest nonetheless, and it made Christians in Western Europe very nervous. There was a real fear that Christian holy sites would be destroyed or desecrated, that relics would be lost, that access to these sacred places would be restricted or eliminated. And in Italy, two rival maritime cities, Bari and Venice, both saw an opportunity. If they could rescue Nicholas's relics from Muslim-controlled territory and bring them to safety in Christian Italy, they'd be heroes. They'd gain prestige. They'd attract pilgrims. They'd literally put themselves on the map as major Christian centers. Plus, and let's be honest here, they'd make a fortune. So in the spring of 1087, a fleet from Bari set out on what was ostensibly a grain trading expedition to Antioch. 3 ships, 62 sailors, 2 priests, and a secret mission: steal the bones of St. Nicholas. They reached Myra on the night of May 8, 1087. The city was quiet. The Church of St. Nicholas, which by this point was actually a new building constructed over the original tomb on the orders of Emperor Theodosius II a few centuries earlier, was guarded by a few Orthodox priests. Not heavily guarded, just there. The Bari sailors tried diplomacy first. They told the priests that the Pope had sent them, that they'd been commanded in a vision to bring Nicholas to Italy, that it was God's will. The priests said, "No, Obviously, this was the most precious thing in their city, the source of their livelihood and identity. They weren't going to just hand it over because some Italian sailors claimed to have had a vision. So the Barians tried bribery. They offered gold, substantial amounts of it. The response, according to a monk named Nicephorus, who chronicled the event shortly afterward, was that the gold was tossed aside like dung, which is a pretty vivid image and suggests the priests were genuinely offended by the offer. At this point, the Barians abandoned subtlety. They grabbed the priests, tied them up, and broke into the tomb. And here's where the account gets really specific in ways that suggest it's probably accurate. One of the sailors, a man named Matteo, was so eager to get to the bones that he jumped down into the sarcophagus while still wearing his boots. The tomb had already been opened before, probably for cleaning or for collecting manna, so the stone cover wasn't sealed. Matteo landed hard on the skeleton, breaking several bones in the process. The team worked frantically, gathering up as many bones as they could in the darkness. They didn't take everything. They were in a hurry, and some of the smaller fragments were probably embedded in the mud and debris at the bottom of the tomb. But they got most of the major bones, the skull, the long bones, vertebrae, ribs. They also broke a vial of the manna in their haste, spilling it on the floor, which felt significant to them, like the saint was crying out at being moved. But they didn't stop. They loaded the bones onto their ships and sailed away into the night, leaving behind confused priests and an empty tomb. Now, put yourself in the shoes of those Myra priests for a second. You wake up, or maybe you're freed from your bonds by neighbors who notice the commotion. You run to the tomb, and it's empty. The bones that have been the center of your religious and economic life for 7 centuries are gone, stolen by foreigners in the night. How do you even begin to process that? It's not just a theft. It's a violation of the sacred. It's the destruction of your city's identity. And what do? You can't exactly call the police. There's no international law enforcement. You can't chase the ships. They're long gone by now. You can't even be sure who took them or where they went. All you can do is mourn and hope that somehow, someday, justice will be done. But justice in this case never came, because when the Barians arrived home on May 9th, 1087, they were greeted as heroes. The entire city turned out to welcome them. Bells rang, prayers were sung, the bones were processed through the streets in a grand celebration. A new basilica was commissioned specifically to house the relics. Construction began almost immediately, and within a decade, Bari had transformed from a relatively minor port city into one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom. The theft worked. It accomplished exactly what it was meant to accomplish, and the fact that it involved lying, violence, and the desecration of a tomb, those were minor details in the grand narrative of rescuing a saint from the infidels. But wait, there's more, because the story doesn't end there. 12 years later in 1099, Venetian ships on their way to the First Crusade stopped at Myra, and some enterprising Venetians thought, hey, the Barians took Nicholas's bones, but did they get everything? So they went to the church, which was still standing, still functioning, though obviously diminished in prestige, and they convinced the local priest to let them search the tomb. Or maybe they broke in again. The accounts are less clear on this part. And they found bones, lots of bones, hundreds of small fragments that the Barians had missed in their haste. Plus, intriguingly, they found bones belonging to Nicholas's uncle, also named Nicholas, confusingly, who'd been buried in the same complex. The Venetians took everything. They brought it all back to Venice and installed it in a monastery church on the Lido, an island in the Venetian lagoon. And now, both cities, Bari and Venice, claim to have the true relics of St. Nicholas. Both attracted pilgrims, both became wealthy from the saint's popularity, and both absolutely insisted that they had the real deal and the other city was lying. This rivalry lasted for centuries. Bari refused to open their tomb to prove what they had. Venice couldn't definitively show that their fragments belonged to Nicholas rather than to some other bishop. It was a stalemate until 1953. That year, the crypt in Bari needed repairs. For the first time in 866 years since the bones had been placed there in 1087, the tomb was opened, and Professor Luigi Martino, an anatomist from the University of Bari, was brought in to examine the remains. What he found was stunning. The bones were scattered in no particular order, consistent with having been hastily grabbed in the dark. There were pebbles and gravel mixed in, consistent with having been scooped up from the bottom of a damp tomb. The skull was carefully placed at one end, but everything else was jumbled. Martino painstakingly identified and cataloged every bone. He determined that they belonged to a single individual, a man who was over 70 years old at the time of death, of slight build, about 5'9". Tall. Several bones showed signs of arthritis. One vertebra had a thin slice cut from it, evidence that a relic had been removed at some point, probably in the Middle Ages, when pieces of saints' bones were distributed to other churches. In 1957, the tomb was opened again for further study. This time, Martino took thousands of X-rays and detailed measurements. He even attempted a facial reconstruction based on the skull, creating drawings of what Nicholas might have looked like, a thin, ascetic face with large eyes and a prominent forehead. And then, in 1992, Martino was invited to Venice to examine their relics. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he concluded that the bone fragments in Venice were complementary to the bones in Bari. Same person, same skeleton, just different pieces. The Barians had grabbed the large bones in their rush. The Venetians got the fragments left behind. Both cities were telling the truth. But the question remains, how do we know it's actually Nicholas? In 2017, researchers took a tiny sample from one of the bone fragments and subjected it to radiocarbon dating. The results: the bone dates to the 4th century AD, exactly where Nicholas would have lived and died. It's not proof positive. It's entirely possible that these are the bones of some other elderly man from 4th century Myra. But the convergence of evidence is compelling. The bones are the right age, from the right time period, from the right location, matching the physical description of Nicholas's death in his 70s. Could it be him? Yes. Is it definitely him? We'll probably never know for certain, but the scientific evidence at least supports the possibility. And that's honestly more than we have for most medieval relics, many of which are demonstrably fake or impossibly duplicated. There are enough splinters of the true cross floating around Europe to build a small forest. There are at least 3 different heads of John the Baptist, but Nicholas's bones, they actually check out scientifically, which is kind of remarkable. There's one more detail I need to tell you about, and it brings us full circle to the Mana. Because even in Bari, even after being moved from Myra, the bones allegedly still produce this mysterious liquid. Every year on May 9th, the anniversary of their arrival in Bari, the tomb is opened in a ceremony, and the archbishop extracts a small amount of liquid that's accumulated in the crypt. This is mixed with holy water bottled and distributed to pilgrims. Scientists have analyzed it. It's still just water, condensation from the humidity of being in an underground crypt in a coastal city. But try telling that to the thousands of people who line up every year to receive their vial of St. Nicholas's manna, who believe with absolute conviction that this water carries the blessing and healing power of the saint. And who am I to say they're wrong? If it brings them comfort, if it strengthens their faith, if it connects them to a tradition stretching back over 1,000 years, does the chemical composition really matter? This is the strange space where science and faith coexist, where facts and meaning aren't the same thing, where a bottle of condensation can be simultaneously ordinary water and holy manna, depending on your perspective. Nicholas's bones are in Italy. That's a fact. They're probably the bones of a 4th century man from Myra. Also probably fact. Whether they retain any spiritual power, whether they can work miracles, whether they deserve veneration, those are questions that science can't answer. Those are matters of faith. But what we can say with certainty is that these bones, or the belief in what these bones represent, have shaped history. They've inspired art, architecture, pilgrimage, devotion. They've given comfort to millions. They've sparked rivalries and funded cities. They've endured for 17 centuries and show no signs of becoming less important to believers. And that's power. Maybe not supernatural power, but power nonetheless. So now we've followed Nicholas from birth to death, to theft, to scientific examination. We've seen how a man becomes a legend, how a legend becomes a cult, how a cult becomes an international phenomenon. But there's still one massive transformation we haven't talked about yet. Because all of this, the miracles, the relics, the manna, all of it is still firmly in the realm of medieval Christian devotion. Nicholas is still a saint, still a bishop, still recognizably religious. So how does that figure become Santa Claus? How does a Mediterranean bishop become a North Pole elf? How does a tradition of venerating bones become a tradition of milk and cookies? That transformation happened thousands of miles away from Myra and Bari. It happened in the Netherlands, and then it happened again in America. And understanding that journey from Sinterklaas to Santa Claus is absolutely essential if we want to complete the unmasking. So that's where we're headed next. We're leaving the relics behind and following the legend across the ocean. We're going to watch as Nicholas sheds his bishop's robes and acquires a red suit, as his white horse becomes a sleigh, as his concern for the poor becomes a focus on children's toys. It's a wild transformation, and it's going to take us into some unexpected places. Wait, I need to back up for a second because I just realized we skipped over the most cinematic moment in this entire story. We talked about the theft. We talked about what happened after, but we didn't really sit with the actual heist itself, the planning, the tension, the moment-by-moment drama of what went down on that May night in 1087. And this is important, because this wasn't some spontaneous decision. This was a calculated operation, a conspiracy involving merchants, sailors, priests, and probably city officials back in Bari who knew exactly what was being planned and gave it their blessing. So, let's rewind. Let's go back to the spring of 1087 and watch this unfold in real time. Because if we're going to understand how Nicholas went from being a regional Eastern saint to a global phenomenon, we need to understand the exact moment when everything changed, when his bones crossed from one world to another, when the Eastern Mediterranean lost him and Western Europe claimed him as their own. This is the story of the greatest relic heist in medieval history, and it's absolutely wild. Imagine you're one of the 62 sailors chosen for this mission. You've been told the official story. You're going to Antioch to trade grain. It's a routine commercial voyage, nothing unusual. But then a few days before departure, you're pulled aside. You and a select group of others, and you're told the real plan. You're going to Myra. You're going to steal the bones of St. Nicholas. You're going to bring them back to Bari and make your city the most important pilgrimage destination in Italy. How do you react to that? Because on one hand, this is exciting. You're being asked to participate in something momentous, something that will be remembered for centuries. You'll be a hero. But on the other hand, you're being asked to commit grave robbery, to violate one of the most sacred tombs in Christendom, to physically assault priests if they resist, to potentially start an international incident that could get you killed. Would you say yes? Would you back out? Would you demand a bigger share of the profits? We don't know what conversations happened on those ships as they sailed east across the Mediterranean. But I'd love to have been a fly on the wall because someone had to have doubts. Someone had to have said, "Are we sure about this? Are we really doing this?" And someone else had to have convinced them that, yes, this was necessary, this was righteous, this wasn't theft, it was rescue. The bones needed to be saved from the Muslims. God wanted this to happen. The Pope allegedly had given his blessing. Whether any of that was true is questionable. But it was the story they told themselves. It was how they justified what they were about to do. They reached Myra after dark on May 8th, and this is where the account from the monk Nicephorus becomes incredibly detailed in ways that suggest he either interviewed the sailors directly or had access to someone who did. The ships anchored offshore. A landing party of about 40 men went ashore in small boats. They left the rest of the crew with the ships, ready to sail at a moment's notice if things went wrong. The Church of St. Nicholas wasn't hard to find. It was one of the largest buildings in the city, recently rebuilt and impressively grand, but it was also relatively unguarded. Just a handful of Orthodox monks and priests who lived on the grounds and maintained the shrine. Now, here's a detail that I find fascinating. The Barians didn't immediately reveal their intentions. They approached the church as pilgrims. They asked to see the tomb. They prayed. They acted respectful and devout. And maybe in that moment they actually were. Maybe they genuinely felt reverence for Nicholas. Maybe they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. The human capacity for cognitive dissonance is remarkable. You can simultaneously venerate a saint and plan to rob his grave. The priests were welcoming at first. They showed the visitors around. They probably offered them some of the manna to take home as a blessing. This was normal. Pilgrims came through all the time. But then the Barians started asking very specific questions. Where exactly was the tomb located? How was it sealed? Were there any other entrances to the crypt? And the priests started to get suspicious. These weren't normal pilgrim questions. These were reconnaissance questions. At some point, and the exact timeline is unclear, the Barians dropped the pretense. One of the men, described in the account as particularly bold, grabbed one of the priests by the collar and demanded to know where the actual bones were. Not the main sarcophagus, but the exact location within it. The priest refused to answer, so they grabbed him, tied him up, and started tying up the other priests as well. There was shouting, probably some pushing and shoving. One of the priests managed to break free and run, presumably to get help from the city authorities, but the Barians moved fast. They knew they had maybe an hour, maybe less, before armed men showed up. They needed those bones, and they needed them now. Here's where Matteo enters the picture. Remember him? The sailor who jumped into the sarcophagus with his boots on. According to Nicephorus, Matteo was young, strong, and impulsive. When the lid of the tomb was pried open, and it took several men with iron bars to do it, Matteo didn't wait for a plan or for someone to carefully excavate the remains. He just jumped down into the cavity, regretted it, because what he landed on wasn't a nice, neat skeleton lying in peaceful repose. It was a jumble of bones, mud, stone fragments, and 700 years' worth of accumulated debris. The skeleton had partially collapsed. Some bones were embedded in sediment. It was dark, damp, and disgusting. Mateo's weight, he was probably wearing leather boots and wool clothing, weighing maybe 160 pounds or so, came down hard on the rib cage and femurs. Bones cracked. The sound in that stone chamber must have been sickening, but there was no time for delicacy. Mateo started scooping up bones and passing them up to the men above. Skull, vertebrae, arm bones, leg bones, ribs, whatever he could grab in the darkness. And this is important. They didn't have proper light. They had maybe 1 or 2 oil lamps, and they couldn't risk making the operation too visible from outside. So they were working mostly by touch in near total darkness, grabbing what felt like bone and throwing it into sacks. In the chaos, someone knocked over a container of the manna. The precious liquid spilled across the stone floor, mixing with mud and God knows what else. And according to the account, this moment hit the sailors hard. They froze because the spilled manna felt like a rebuke, like Nicholas himself was weeping at being disturbed, like they had crossed a line, but they had already crossed so many lines. There was no going back now, so they kept working. One sailor, we don't know his name, tried to be methodical. He was apparently grabbing smaller fragments, finger bones, pieces of vertebrae. But another sailor snapped at him. "We don't have time for that. Just get the big ones." So they focused on the major bones, the ones that were obviously important, the ones that would be recognizable as human remains. They left behind hundreds of smaller fragments, chips of bone, teeth, tiny pieces that had broken off over the centuries. This, by the way, is how we know the Venetians were telling the truth when they said they found bones in 1099. Because the Barians absolutely did leave stuff behind. Not because they wanted to, but because they were in a panic, working in the dark, and they didn't have time to sift through centuries of accumulated debris. After maybe 20 minutes of frantic excavation, someone outside shouted that they could hear voices approaching. Armed men, probably the city was waking up to what was happening. Time to go. The sailors grabbed their sacks of bones, left the tomb in disarray, and ran for the boats. The tied-up priests were shouting, probably cursing, definitely praying. But the Barians were already gone, rowing hard for the ships anchored offshore. Here's a question. At what point during that escape did they realize they might actually get away with this? Because for those first few minutes as they were rowing away from shore, they must have been terrified, expecting arrows, expecting pursuit boats, expecting divine retribution in the form of a sudden storm or a sea monster or something. But none of that happened. The sea was calm. The wind was favorable. By the time any kind of organized response could be mounted, the Barian ships were already pulling up anchor and sailing west. They had done it. They had actually stolen the bones of St. Nicholas. And now they had to get those bones home, which meant sailing across the Mediterranean roughly 800 miles with their illegal cargo, with the constant fear that something would go wrong, that they'd encounter pirates, that a storm would sink them, and the bones would be lost forever, that Nicholas himself would punish them for this sacrilege. The voyage took weeks, and we don't have detailed accounts of what happened during those weeks, but I'd bet anything that those sailors were on edge the entire time, jumping at every unusual wave, interpreting every bit of bad weather as a sign of divine displeasure, probably praying more than they'd ever prayed in their lives, because they were now in possession of the most valuable cargo they'd ever carried. Not valuable in terms of money, though the bones would certainly generate wealth, but valuable in terms of spiritual power. They were transporting a saint. And saints, in medieval belief, weren't passive objects. They had agency. They could work miracles or cause disasters. They needed to be treated with respect. So the bones were probably kept in the best cabin, protected from moisture and rough handling. The sailors probably took turns guarding them, praying over them, asking Nicholas to forgive them for the manner of his relocation, and to please, please ensure they made it home safely. And then, on May 9th, 1087, they rounded the last headland, and Bari came into view. And someone must have sent word ahead because the entire city was waiting. The waterfront was packed with people, bells were ringing, priests in full ceremonial vestments were standing on the docks. Can you imagine the relief those sailors must have felt? They'd gambled everything on this mission, and they'd won. The bones were carried off the ships in a grand procession. They were placed on a litter, essentially a portable platform, and paraded through the streets of Bari while the crowd went absolutely wild. People were crying, reaching out to touch the litter, falling to their knees in prayer. This wasn't just a religious moment. This was a civic triumph. Bari had just acquired the relics of one of the most beloved saints in Christendom. They'd beaten Venice to the prize. They'd transformed their city's destiny in a single bold stroke. And the sailors, they were heroes. Their names were recorded. They were probably given money, land, positions of honor. They'd earned it. But I wonder if any of them, in the quiet moments after the celebrations died down, thought about the priests they'd tied up in Myra, about the tomb they'd desecrated, about whether the end really did justify the means. Because here's the thing from the Barian perspective. This was a rescue mission. They were saving Nicholas from potential destruction at the hands of Muslim rulers. They were bringing him to safety in Christian territory where he'd be properly honored. But from the Myra perspective, this was theft, violation, cultural imperialism, the West coming in and taking what belonged to the East, claiming moral superiority while committing violence. Both perspectives are valid. Both are true depending on where you stand. And that moral ambiguity is part of what makes this story so compelling. Within a year of the Bones' arrival, construction began on a massive new basilica dedicated to St. Nicholas. This wasn't a small church. This was a statement. The Basilica di San Nicola, which still stands in Bari today, was designed to be one of the most impressive churches in southern Italy. It took about 16 years to complete the basic structure. The relics were temporarily housed in a small chapel while the main basilica was being built. And during that time, pilgrims started arriving. First a trickle, then a flood. People came from all over Italy, then from France, Germany, England. The news spread. St. Nicholas is in Bari. His relics are working miracles. You can visit his tomb, collect his manna, pray for his intercession, and the money started flowing in. Donations, offerings, payment for lodging and food, the sale of pilgrim badges and holy water bottles and little vials of manna. Bari became wealthy. Not gradually, practically overnight. This is one of the most successful city rebranding campaigns in history. Before 1087, Bari was just another port town. After 1087, it was the city of St. Nicholas. Its entire identity changed. And that brings us to a question we've been dancing around. Was this theft morally justified? The medieval church clearly thought so. Pope Urban II himself came to Bari in 1089 to formally enshrine the relics. His presence was an implicit endorsement. He didn't say, "You shouldn't have stolen these." He said, "This is wonderful. Let's celebrate." And in the logic of the time, it made sense. Relics weren't owned by any individual or even any single church. They belonged to all of Christendom. Moving them from a place where they might be endangered to a place where they'd be venerated wasn't theft. It was stewardship. Plus, there was a belief that saints could influence where their relics ended up. If Nicholas hadn't wanted to go to Bari, he could have prevented it. He could have sunk the ships. He could have struck the sailors dead. The fact that the mission succeeded was itself proof that it was divinely sanctioned. At least that's what people told themselves. But let's bring this into modern context for a second, because this isn't just ancient history. This is a pattern that is repeated throughout history and continues today. Think about the Elgin marbles, sculptures taken from the Parthenon in Athens and now housed in the British Museum in London. The British argue they were legally acquired and are better preserved in London than they would be in Greece. The Greeks argue they were stolen cultural patrimony and should be returned. Think about artifacts looted from Egypt, from Iraq, from Peru, from countless colonized nations now sitting in Western museums. The arguments are always the same. We're preserving these treasures for all humanity. They're safer here. We can give them proper scholarly attention, and the counter-arguments are always the same too. These belong to our culture. You took them without permission. Return them. The theft of Nicholas's relics is an early version of this same debate, and there's no easy answer. Both sides have legitimate points. Both are driven by a mixture of genuine reverence and self-interest. What I find most interesting is that the people of Myra didn't just give up and accept the loss. For centuries, literally for centuries, there were attempts to get the bones back, diplomatic requests, appeals to the Pope, even a few half-hearted plots to steal them back. None of it worked. Bari held on tight, and eventually Myra faded from the pilgrimage circuit while Bari thrived. Geography is destiny. Access is power. And in the medieval relic economy, possession really was 9/10 of the law. There's one final twist to this story that we need to address before we move on, and it involves a name you've probably never heard. Wait, actually, you probably have heard of Rockwell. He's one of the most famous American illustrators of the 20th century, but you might not know that he drew Santa Claus a lot. Between 1913 and 1930, Rockwell created numerous Santa illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post, one of the most popular magazines in America, and his Santas were different from Nast's in subtle but important ways. Rockwell's Santa was more human, more realistic, less cartoonish. You could see the texture of his skin, the individual hairs in his beard, the way fabric folded over his belly. Rockwell painted Santa as if he were a real person you could photograph, not a caricature or symbol. And this shift mattered, because it made Santa feel more present, more possible. Children looking at Rockwell's illustrations could almost believe that Santa was real, that if you went to the North Pole, you might actually find this exact man working in his workshop. Rockwell's Santa was still jolly, still gift-giving, still wearing red, but he was grounded in a kind of hyper-realism that made the fantasy more believable. And then, in the 1930s, another artist would take Rockwell's approach and amplify it to a global scale. An artist working not for a magazine, but for a corporation. An artist whose version of Santa would be reproduced millions of times would appear on billboards and in advertisements and on Coca-Cola bottles around the world. His name was Haddon Sundblom, and the corporation he worked for was Coca-Cola. Now, before we dive into the Coca-Cola chapter, and trust me, we're going to dive deep, I want to pause and take stock of where we are. We've followed St. Nicholas from a 4th century Mediterranean bishop to a Dutch folk figure to an American cultural icon. We've watched him transform from a stern religious authority to a jolly gift giver. We've seen artists shape his image, writers expand his mythology, and a commercial economy adopt him as a mascot. And through all of this, certain core elements have persisted. Generosity, secret giving, concern for children, the idea that kindness should be rewarded and celebrated. Those themes connect the Nicholas of Myra to the Santa Claus of Manhattan across 1,700 years across continents and cultures and enormous transformations that thread has held. But we're not done yet. Because the Santa we know today, the globally recognized, universally understood figure who appears in shopping malls from Tokyo to Sao Paulo, that Santa was created in the 20th century through advertising, through Coca-Cola's marketing campaigns, through the deliberate, calculated efforts of a company that saw in Santa Claus not just a character, but a brand opportunity. And that story, the story of how a corporation took a folk figure and turned him into the most recognized fictional character on the planet, is both inspiring and troubling. It's a story about creativity and commerce, about art and capitalism, about how meaning gets made in the modern world. So that's where we're going next. We're going to talk about Haddon Sunbloom, about Coca-Cola's Christmas campaigns, about the myth that Coca-Cola invented the red suit, and the truth about what they actually did do. We're going to explore how Santa Claus went from being American to being global, how he became bigger than any single culture, any single tradition, any single meaning. And we're going to ask the uncomfortable question, when a corporation owns a saint's image, who does that saint belong to? Stay with me. Because this final transformation from cultural icon to commercial property to global phenomenon is the wildest part of the journey, and it's going to force us to reckon with what Santa Claus actually means in the 21st century. The story isn't over. It's just changing shape one more time. Let me tell you about one of the most persistent myths in advertising history. A story so widely believed that it's taken on the quality of accepted fact, even though it's demonstrably, provably false. The myth goes like this. Before Coca-Cola started using Santa Claus in their advertising campaigns in the 1930s, Santa wore green or blue or various colors. He looked different depending on who was drawing him. But then Coca-Cola, wanting to align Santa with their brand colors of red and white, redesigned him. They put him in a red suit to match their logo. They standardized his appearance. They essentially invented the modern image of Santa Claus for marketing purposes. And because of this, the story concludes, the Santa we know today, the red-suited jolly figure, is actually a corporate creation, a product of capitalism, a billboard in human form. It's a great story. It's compelling. It feels true, especially if you're already skeptical about corporate influence on culture. And it's been repeated so many times in so many places that millions of people believe it without question. There's just one problem. It's complete nonsense. Santa Claus was wearing red decades before Coca-Cola ever drew him. And we can prove it with receipts, with dated illustrations, with historical evidence that's so clear and overwhelming that the only mystery is how this myth ever got started in the first place. But here's the twist. Even though Coca-Cola didn't invent Red Santa, they did something arguably more significant. They took Santa global. They turned a primarily American and European figure into a worldwide phenomenon. They made Santa Claus recognizable in places that had never heard of St. Nicholas, that didn't celebrate Christmas in the Western tradition, that had no cultural connection to Christianity whatsoever. So the real story of Coca-Cola and Santa is more interesting than the myth. Let me show you why. First, let's kill the myth once and for all, because this is important. Santa Claus was depicted in red and white in American illustrations as early as the 1860s. We have documented proof. There's an advertisement for a confectionery company in New York. From 1868, 14 years before Coca-Cola was even invented, that shows Santa in a red suit with white fur trim. The ad was for sugar plums. And there's Santa looking exactly like he does today. Red coat, white beard, jolly expression. Louis Prang, the German immigrant who basically invented the American Christmas card industry in the 1870s and 1880s, produced numerous cards showing Santa in red. These were mass-produced and distributed across the country. Millions of Americans saw these images before Coca-Cola was a gleam in anyone's eye. And Thomas Nast, who we just talked about, was consistently drawing Santa in red from the 1860s through the 1880s. His illustrations appeared in Harper's Weekly, one of the most widely circulated magazines in America. By the time Nast retired, Red Santa was already the dominant version. In fact, by the early 20th century, well before Coca-Cola's Santa campaigns, there was already a New York Times article from 1927 that explicitly stated, "A standardized Santa Claus appears to New York children. Height, weight, stature are almost exactly standardized, as are the red garments, the hood, and the white whiskers." 1927. That's 4 years before Coca-Cola hired Haddon Sundblom to create their first Santa advertisements. The standardization had already happened. So where did the myth come from? Probably from a combination of factors. Coca-Cola's campaigns were so successful, so ubiquitous, that people assumed they must have created what they were promoting. It's a classic case of conflating popularity with origin. Plus, there's something appealing about the narrative of a corporation inventing a cultural icon. It confirms our suspicions about the power of advertising and capitalism. But it's not true, and we need to be clear about that before we talk about what Coca-Cola actually did do. So, what did Coca-Cola do? In 1931, the company had a problem. A very specific, very urgent problem. They sold a cold beverage. And in winter, people didn't want cold beverages. Sales plummeted every December, just when other retailers were making their biggest profits of the year. Coca-Cola needed a way to make people think of their product during the holiday season. They needed to associate Coke with Christmas, with warmth, with family gatherings, with tradition, even though their product was literally cold and had nothing inherently to do with any of those things. Enter Archie Lee, an advertising executive at the Darcy Agency, which handled Coca-Cola's account. Lee proposed using Santa Claus as the centerpiece of a Christmas campaign. Not just any Santa, but a very specific kind of Santa. Warm, realistic, approachable, human. A Santa who could hold a Coca-Cola bottle and make it seem like the most natural thing in the world. And Lee knew exactly the artist for the job, Haddon Sundblom. Sundblom was a Swedish-American illustrator working in Chicago. He was known for his ability to paint hyper-realistic human figures that still had warmth and personality. His people looked like people, not like cartoons or caricatures. They had texture, dimension, life. And Sundblom was told explicitly to draw inspiration from Clement Clarke Moore's poem, "'Twas the night before Christmas, the right jolly old elf with the round belly and twinkling eyes, but to make him real, to make him someone you could believe actually existed." So Sundblom sat down and created what would become the most reproduced Santa Claus image in history. Here's what made Sundblom's Santa different from what had come before. First, the realism. Sundblom didn't draw Santa. He painted him in oils with incredible attention to detail. You could see the individual threads in Santa's fur trim, the way light reflected off the fabric of his suit, the subtle variations in skin tone on his face, the wetness in his eyes, the texture of his white hair. This wasn't an illustration. This was a portrait of a person who happened to be Santa Claus. Second, the personality. Sundblom's Santa wasn't posed stiffly or formally. He was caught in natural moments, raiding a refrigerator for a midnight snack, reading letters from children, playing with toys, pausing during his deliveries to enjoy a refreshing Coca-Cola. There was humor in these images, warmth, a sense that Santa wasn't some distant, judgmental figure, but someone you'd genuinely enjoy spending time with, someone who'd laugh at your jokes and tell you stories and make you feel safe and loved. Third, the consistency. This is crucial. Sundblom painted Santa for Coca-Cola every single year from 1931 and 1964. 33 years, dozens of paintings, and in every single one, Santa looked the same. Same face, same proportions, same red suit, same white beard. This created a visual continuity that was unprecedented. For 3 decades, anyone who saw a Coca-Cola ad during the holidays saw the exact same Santa year after year, consistently, reliably. And that consistency did something remarkable. It trained people's brains. It created an association so strong that even today, if you ask someone to picture Santa Claus, they're probably visualizing something very close to Sundblom's paintings. The round face, the rosy cheeks, the specific shade of red in the suit, the way the white trim sits on his shoulders. Now, let's talk about how these images were distributed, because that's where the real magic happened. Coca-Cola didn't just put Sundblom's Santa in magazine ads, though they did that too. They put him everywhere. On billboards, on posters in stores, on cardboard cutouts that stood in shop windows, on the sides of delivery trucks, on serving trays, on calendars that hung in kitchens across America. And Coca-Cola wasn't a small regional company. By the 1930s, they were already one of the largest advertisers in the world. They had distribution networks that reached every corner of the United States, and increasingly, they were expanding globally. So Sundblom's Santa appeared in Canada, in Mexico, in Europe, in South America. Anywhere Coca-Cola sold products, Sundblom's Santa showed up. And here's what happened. People who had never seen Santa Claus before, who had no cultural tradition of gift-giving fat men in red suits, encountered this image. And because it was attached to Coca-Cola, an American brand that was becoming synonymous with modernity, with capitalism, with Western culture, they adopted it. Santa Claus became a cultural export. Like blue jeans and rock music and Hollywood movies, Santa was part of the package of Americanization that swept the world in the 20th century. And Coca-Cola was the primary delivery mechanism. Did Coca-Cola invent Santa? No. Did they standardize him globally? Absolutely. Let me give you a specific example of how this worked, because I think it illustrates the process beautifully. In Japan, Christmas wasn't traditionally celebrated. Japan is predominantly Shinto and Buddhist. Christian holidays weren't part of the cultural calendar. But after World War II, during the American occupation, Western cultural influences flooded in. And one of those influences was Christmas. Japanese retailers, always eager to adopt successful Western marketing strategies, started promoting Christmas as a time to give gifts and celebrate. And they needed a symbol for this holiday. They needed a mascot. Guess who they chose? Santa Claus. Specifically, the Coca-Cola version of Santa Claus, the Sundblom Santa. So today in Japan, you can walk through Tokyo in December and see Santa Claus everywhere, in shop windows, on television, in advertisements, and he looks exactly like the American Santa. Red suit, white beard, jolly expression. But here's the fascinating part. For many Japanese people, Christmas isn't a religious holiday. It's a commercial holiday, a romantic holiday, actually. Couples go on dates, exchange gifts, eat fancy dinners. And Santa Claus is just a fun symbol associated with that celebration. Divorced from Christianity, divorced from St. Nicholas, just a cheerful figure who represents gift-giving and winter joy. That's cultural globalization in action. That's Coca-Cola's real contribution. Not creating Santa, but spreading him so widely and so effectively that he transcended his origins and became universal. But there's a darker side to this story that we need to acknowledge. Because when a corporation becomes the primary propagator of a cultural symbol, they start to own that symbol in ways that aren't always healthy or appropriate. Coca-Cola trademarked their specific Sunblum Santa images. They fiercely protected their right to use Santa in advertising. And while they couldn't prevent other companies from using Santa, you can't trademark a folk character. They could and did dominate the visual landscape. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Who does Santa Claus belong to? Does he belong to the Catholic Church as the original St. Nicholas? Does he belong to Dutch culture, which created Sinterklaas? Does he belong to American culture, which transformed him into the modern Santa? Does he belong to Coca-Cola, which globalized his image? Or does he belong to all of us, to the children who believe in him, to the parents who perpetuate the myth, to the artists who keep reinterpreting him, to the cultures that adapt him to their own contexts? I think the answer is the last one. Santa Claus is too big now to be owned by anyone. He's escaped the boundaries of any single culture or corporation. He's a global commons, shared cultural property. But Coca-Cola tried really hard to own him, and to some extent they succeeded. Because even though you can draw your own Santa, even though anyone can use the character, the version of Santa that most people picture is still fundamentally the Sunblum version, the Coca-Cola version. And that gives the company a kind of soft power, a cultural influence that translates into brand loyalty, into sales, into profit. Here's something you might not know. Coca-Cola wasn't even the first soft drink company to use Santa Claus in advertising. White Rock Beverages used Santa in ads for their mineral water in 1915, 16 years before Coca-Cola. And in the 1920s, White Rock used Santa in color advertisements for drink mixers. Santa in red, drinking their product. So why do we remember Coca-Cola's Santa and not White Rock's? Because of scale, because of persistence, because of the sheer volume of money Coca-Cola poured into their campaigns year after year for decades. White Rock ran some ads. Coca-Cola ran an empire. And that's a lesson about how cultural dominance works. It's not always about being first. It's about being biggest, loudest, most consistent, most ubiquitous. Money amplifies. And Coca-Cola had more money than anyone else. So their version of Santa drowned out all the competitors, not through any nefarious scheme, but through the simple mechanics of market dominance. Now I want to bring this back to something personal for a second, because I think there's a tendency when we talk about corporate influence on culture to be either naively celebratory or reflexively critical. Some people say Coca-Cola gave us the Santa we know and love. How wonderful. And other people say Coca-Cola corrupted a sacred figure for profit. How terrible. And I think both of those reactions miss something important. What Coca-Cola did was take an existing cultural figure, one that had already been shaped by centuries of evolution, by artists and writers and oral tradition, and they amplified it. They gave it reach. They made it accessible to people who would never have encountered it otherwise. Did they do this for altruistic reasons? Of course not. They did it to sell soda. They did it because happy, warm feelings about Santa could translate into happy, warm feelings about their product. It was a calculated business decision. But the result, the global spread of Santa Claus, has had effects that go beyond selling Coca-Cola. It has created a shared cultural reference point. It has given millions of children a figure to believe in. It has provided a framework for generosity and gift-giving that transcends national boundaries. Is that good? Is that bad? I honestly think it's both. It's complicated, like most things involving the intersection of culture and commerce. What I do know is that we should be honest about it. We shouldn't pretend Coca-Cola invented Santa. They didn't. But we also shouldn't pretend they had no influence. They had enormous influence. And we should think critically about what it means when corporations have the power to shape global culture. Because that power is real, and it's not going away. If anything, in our current age of social media and global brands and viral marketing, it's only getting stronger. There's one more thing I need to tell you about Sun Blum's Santa before we move on, and it's kind of touching. When Sun Blum first started painting Santa for Coca-Cola, he used a live model. A friend of his, a retired salesman named Lou Prentice, posed in a Santa suit while Sun Blum painted. But after Prentice died, Sun Blum didn't want to use anyone else. So for the next 3 decades, he painted Santa from his own face. He would look in a mirror, imagine himself as Santa, and paint what he saw, which means the Santa Claus that billions of people have seen, the face that has become the universal image of Christmas joy, is actually the face of Haden Sundblom, a Swedish-American illustrator from Chicago, a man who probably never imagined his features would become one of the most recognized faces on Earth. There's something beautiful about that, something very human. A reminder that behind every cultural icon, behind every global brand, behind every corporate campaign, there are actual people making decisions, holding paintbrushes, looking in mirrors. Sundblom didn't set out to change the world. He was just trying to do a good job for a client. But the thing he created outlived him, outlasted the company that commissioned it, became something bigger than its origins. That's the power of art, even commercial art. That's the strange alchemy that happens when creativity meets distribution meets cultural need. So we've reached the end of Santa's transformation from 4th century bishop to Dutch folk figure, to American icon, to global phenomenon. From Mediterranean martyr to capitalist mascot. And now we need to ask, what does it all mean? What are we left with after unmasking Santa Claus, after separating the man from the myth, the history from the legend, the sacred from the commercial? Is Santa Claus still meaningful? Is he still worth believing in, even if the belief is metaphorical? Is there anything real left underneath all the layers of cultural accretion and corporate branding? Or is he just a hollow symbol, a marketing construct, a story we tell ourselves to sell products and perpetuate capitalism? Those are the questions we need to grapple with as we bring this journey to a close. Because unmasking Santa isn't just about history. It's about us. About what we value, about how we relate to myth and meaning in the modern world. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the final chapter of this story. So stay with me. We're almost at the end. And I promise you, the conclusion is worth the wait. Here we are, the end of a 1700-year journey. From the sun-baked streets of 4th century Myra to the shopping malls of 21st century America, from a flesh-and-blood bishop named Nicholas to a mythological figure recognized by billions of people worldwide. And I want to start this final chapter with a simple question. Now that we've unmasked Santa Claus, now that we know the real story behind the legend, what do we do with that knowledge? Because here's the paradox we're facing. Santa Claus is objectively speaking not real. There's no man at the North Pole. There are no flying reindeer. Chimneys don't magically accommodate rotund intruders on Christmas Eve. Every present under every tree was purchased by actual humans using actual money. And yet, Santa Claus is real. He exists in our collective imagination. He shapes behavior. He generates genuine joy. He creates meaning in people's lives. Millions of children go to bed on Christmas Eve with hearts pounding with anticipation because they believe in him. Adults spend hours carefully maintaining that belief, finding profound satisfaction in the magic they create. So which is true? Is Santa real or not? The answer, I think, is that we're asking the wrong question, because reality isn't binary, it's layered. And Santa Claus exists in a layer of reality that's just as powerful, just as consequential as physical reality. The layer of meaning, of story, of shared cultural belief. Let me give you some numbers to illustrate what I mean. In the United States alone, Christmas generates over $1 trillion in retail sales annually. $1 trillion. That's more than the GDP of most countries on Earth, and a significant portion of that spending is done in the name of Santa Claus. Parents buying gifts to place under the tree, retailers creating Santa displays, companies running Santa-themed advertisements. In the United Kingdom, Christmas accounts for approximately £20 billion in retail sales during the December season. In Australia, in Brazil, in South Africa, in dozens of countries that have adopted Western Christmas traditions, the story is the same. Massive economic activity organized around a figure who doesn't physically exist. But it's not just economics, it's cultural, it's social, it's emotional. There are over 400,000 people employed as shopping mall Santas around the world during the holiday season. 400,000. That's more than the population of many cities. And these aren't just minimum wage jobs. Professional Santas can earn substantial money, and many take the role incredibly seriously. They go to Santa schools. They learn how to interact with children, how to maintain character, how to create magical moments. There are entire organizations dedicated to this. The International University of Santa Claus in Michigan, the Ministry of Fun Santa School in the UK, places where adults train to embody a fictional character because they understand how important that character is to children and families. And every year, millions of children sit on these Santa's laps. They whisper their wishes. They promise to be good. They participate in a ritual that's been repeated for generations. A ritual that shapes their understanding of generosity, of reward, of the relationship between behavior and consequence. Is that real? I'd argue yes. Powerfully, undeniably real. But there's something even more interesting happening with Santa Claus in our current moment. Something that reveals how the figure continues to evolve, continues to adapt to new cultural contexts. Santa Claus has become increasingly diverse. In recent years, you can find Black Santas, Asian Santas, Hispanic Santas. Shopping malls now often feature multiple Santas representing different backgrounds. There are deaf Santas who communicate in sign language. There are Santas in wheelchairs. There are female Santa figures breaking the traditional gender barrier. And this diversification has sparked intense debate. Some people argue that Santa should stay the way he's always been, white, male, able-bodied. They see changes as political correctness run amok, as an attack on tradition. But here's what those critics forget. Santa has always changed. Every single generation has reinvented him. The Dutch changed him from a Greek bishop to Sinterklaas. Americans changed him from Sinterklaas to Santa Claus. Thomas Nast gave him a workshop in reindeer. Coca-Cola gave him global reach. Change is the tradition, and the push for diverse representation isn't about erasing Santa. It's about expanding access to the magic. It's about making sure that children of all backgrounds can see themselves reflected in this figure of generosity and joy. It's about recognizing that the meaning Santa represents, kindness, giving, unconditional love, isn't limited to any one culture or appearance. I find that beautiful, actually. The fact that a 4th century Mediterranean saint has become so universal that he can take on any face, any form, and still carry the same essential message. Now, I want to talk about something that might surprise you: the persistence of belief in Santa despite widespread knowledge that he's not physically real. Think about it. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information. Any child with a smartphone can Google, "Is Santa real?" and get a definitive answer in seconds. And yet, the Santa tradition not only survives, but thrives. Parents go to extraordinary lengths to maintain the illusion. They eat the cookies left out for Santa. They track Santa's journey on NORAD's Santa Tracker. Yes, that's a real thing. The North American Aerospace Defense Command has been tracking Santa since 1955. They fabricate elaborate stories about how Santa gets into apartments without chimneys. Why? If everyone knows Santa isn't real, why do we collectively pretend otherwise? Because the pretending matters. Because the story does something that facts alone cannot do. It creates wonder. It preserves a space for imagination in a world that's often too harsh, too literal, too focused on the quantifiable and measurable. Child psychologists have studied this extensively. And what they've found is that believing in Santa and then eventually learning the truth is actually a healthy developmental process. It teaches children about the difference between fantasy and reality. It helps them understand that their parents love them enough to create magic for them. It introduces them to the concept of metaphorical truth, the idea that something can be meaningful even if it's not literally factual. In other words, Santa is a training ground for dealing with complexity, for understanding that the world isn't always black and white. That meaning exists in the spaces between true and false. But there's also a critique we need to address because not everyone sees Santa as innocent fun. Some people argue that the Santa tradition is harmful. The most common criticism is that Santa is a tool of class inequality. Rich children get expensive presents from Santa. Poor children get less or nothing. And this creates a painful cognitive dissonance. If you're told that Santa brings gifts to children who are good and you're good but get very little, what conclusion are you supposed to draw? That you're not good enough? That you don't deserve nice things? This is a real problem, and it's led some parents, particularly those struggling economically, to reject the Santa tradition entirely. They tell their children that presents come from family, not from a magical stranger. They want their kids to understand that material goods are limited by real-world economic constraints, not by arbitrary judgments about worthiness. I think that's a legitimate choice, and it points to a deeper issue. Santa Claus, as currently practiced, is deeply entangled with consumerism. The focus on presents, on material abundance, on getting what you want. That's not really about the historical Nicholas who gave secretly to prevent suffering. It's about modern capitalism, about training children to desire and consume. So when we teach children to believe in Santa, are we teaching them about generosity, or are we teaching them that happiness comes from getting stuff? The answer, as always, is probably both. And it depends on how individual families navigate the tradition. Let me tell you about something I find genuinely inspiring, though. There are organizations around the world that have reclaimed the Santa tradition for genuine charitable purposes. Secret Santa programs where anonymous donors pay off layaway accounts for struggling families. Santa runs, where thousands of people dress as Santa and run marathons to raise money for children's hospitals. Operation Santa, run by the United States Postal Service, which allows people to respond to letters written by children in need. These initiatives strip away the commercial aspects and return to something closer to the original Nicholas spirit, using resources to help people doing it with joy, creating moments of unexpected grace. And that, I think, is where the real value of the Santa Claus tradition lies, not in the mythology itself, but in what the mythology inspires us to do, not in believing that a magic man brings presents, but in acting like that magic man ourselves, giving without expecting recognition, finding joy in others' happiness, creating wonder where none existed before. Nicholas of Myra, whoever he actually was, probably wouldn't recognize Santa Claus. The North Pole, the reindeer, the elves, none of that would make sense to him. But the impulse behind it, the desire to give generously, to help those in need, to do it with a spirit of joy rather than obligation, that he would understand perfectly. So where does this leave us? After 12 parts, after hours of storytelling, after examining every layer of this incredible historical onion, what's the takeaway? I think it's this. Santa Claus is one of humanity's most successful myths. And I use the word myth not as a synonym for lie, but in its proper anthropological sense, a story that conveys meaning, that shapes behavior, that helps a culture understand itself. This Santa myth tells us that generosity is valuable, that children deserve joy, that magic is possible, even if that magic is created by human hands rather than supernatural forces, that there are rewards for goodness, even if those rewards are given by parents rather than flying reindeer. Are these lessons perfect? No. They can be corrupted by commercialism, by inequality, by the very human tendency to take something beautiful and make it transactional. But at their core, they're valuable lessons. And the fact that we've wrapped them in such an elaborate, ridiculous, wonderful story, a story about a fat man squeezing down chimneys and flying through the air on a sleigh pulled by magical deer, doesn't diminish their value. It enhances it. It makes them memorable, transmissible, emotionally resonant in a way that direct moral instruction never could be. Here's my final thought, and then I promise I'll let you go. In unmasking Santa Claus, we haven't destroyed him. We've revealed him. We've shown that he's not one thing but many things, a saint and a myth, a historical person and a cultural construct, a religious figure and a secular symbol, a gift giver and a marketing tool. He's all of these at once, and that complexity, that multiplicity is what makes him so enduring. He can be whatever we need him to be. A reminder of faith for believers, a celebration of family for the secular, a symbol of generosity for everyone. And the story of how he got here from the dusty streets of Myra to the global stage is a story about us, about how humans create meaning, how we preserve what matters across generations, how we adapt old stories to new contexts, how we take the sacred and make it accessible, how we take the commercial and find the sacred within it. Nicholas of Myra helped a few people in a small city 1,700 years ago. And because of choices made by countless individuals across countless generations, artists, writers, advertisers, parents, children, his legacy now touches billions of people worldwide. That's extraordinary. That's the kind of impact that transcends any single life, any single culture, any single intention. So is Santa Claus real in every way that actually matters? Yes. He's real in the joy he brings, real in the generosity he inspires, real in the memories created in his name, real in the countless acts of kindness performed because people consciously or unconsciously are channeling the spirit of that 4th century bishop who threw gold through a window to save 3 daughters from despair. The man is dust. The bones are in Bari. The miracles are legends. But the meaning is alive, and it will continue to evolve, to adapt, to be reimagined by future generations who will add their own layers to this incredible, ridiculous, beautiful story. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking this journey with me, for following me from ancient Myra to modern shopping malls, for asking hard questions, for thinking critically about sources and evidence and what we can actually know about the past, for being willing to see Santa Claus not as a simple children's story, but as a complex cultural phenomenon that reveals deep truths about human nature and society. I hope this has changed how you see Christmas. I hope the next time you see a Santa Claus, you'll think about the 4th century bishop, about the Dutch settlers, about Thomas Nast and Haddon Sundblom, and all the people who contributed to creating this figure. I hope you'll see the layers, the history, the meaning beneath the mythology. And I hope, despite knowing the truth, you'll still find some magic in it. Because that's the real gift of Santa Claus, not the presents, but the reminder that humans are capable of creating wonder. That we can take a small act of kindness and turn it into a global tradition. That we can believe in impossible things and make them real through the sheer force of our collective imagination. This has been the story of unmasking Santa Claus, but it's also just one story among many. History is full of these moments where myth and reality intertwine, where legends grow from seeds of truth, where the past reaches forward to shape the present in unexpected ways. And I can't wait to share more of them with you. So stay curious, stay questioning, keep digging beneath the surface of the stories you've always taken for granted, because there's always more to discover, always another layer, always another truth hiding behind the myth. Until next time, take care, be generous, create some magic, and remember, the best way to honor St. Nicholas isn't to believe in Santa Claus, but to act like him.